I miss my man. I remember getting up every morning with him, making sure that he was getting up for work, making sure he was doing right by his kids. We will never get Sean back.
Unbeknownst to them, they're being stalked by the individuals in this red vehicle, as he was sitting side by side with his cold-blooded killer.
A lot of these cases are committed by people who are known to each other, whether it's rivals or enemies on the street.
If you really sum it up, the whole case was about revenge.
January 17th, 2021. It's around 6 a.m. when 36-year-old Lestine Robinson wakes up in her hotel room in Vinings, Georgia, just outside Atlanta. She's on a trip from Chicago with her 22-year-old boyfriend, Sean Gray. But she's surprised to discover he's not there.
I woke up, I didn't have no cover on me, and I just had on my little lingerie. And I was reaching for him. I guess I was coming to my senses. I'm like, oh, hold on, Sean ain't been here with me all night. You know, since I fell asleep. I thought Sean had crept off. And I'm texting him, and I'm like, I know you did not bring me to Atlanta to do this. Like, an hour went past, and I was just laying there, and I'm still texting, no Sean. I was calling Sean's phone, and somebody had answered his phone. Finally, somebody picked up. I thought it was him. Then the man said, you been just calling this phone. And I'm like, well, who is you? Because now, this not Sean answering his phone. And Sean had two phones. Then the man hung the phone up. And I called back again on the FaceTime. The lady from the front desk answers. I'm like, how you get these phones? You know, asking her. And she said that the guy had brought her the stuff. So I'm like, that's my man's phone. She like, laughed and joked like, well, did he lose some shoes or something? And I'm like, some shoes? I'm like, let me see the shoes. So I was laying in the bed. She showed me the shoes. This is Air Force Ones that he just bought while we was here in Atlanta. He bought them Thursday when we went to the mall. The shoes was bloody. The strings was scuffed up. I instantly jumped up. Where y'all get this from? And she like, in the parking lot. I ran right out the door with what I had on. I didn't come through that lobby presentable or even with a level head. I came in there going off, and they were trying to calm me down. I was saying everything that could come to my mind, because at this point, y'all got my man phones, y'all got his shoes, they bloody, his strings are scuffed up, his shoes are scuffed up. Now, where's my man?
Sean Gray was born in the inner city of Chicago, Illinois, to a drug-addicted mother and an absentee father. So his paternal grandmother was the one who was responsible for raising him and his other two siblings. Sean's grandmother really saved him and his siblings. She worked 2 jobs, she worked extremely hard, and that really stuck with Sean.
Sean was a good kid. He didn't get into much trouble growing up.
Despite a difficult childhood, Sean seemed to have a bright future ahead of him. But after high school, his grandmother passed away, and things took a different turn.
Sean was growing up in Chicago at a very violent time in the city's history. There were a lot of gang activities. There was a lot of drug activities.
Sean wasn't perfect, and no human being is perfect, and we all make mistakes. After Sean graduated North Chicago High School, he was trying to find himself, and he got caught up in the streets. He ended up going to jail for a little bit, I think for like a year or so. When Sean got out of jail, he did straighten himself up. He found them a job through a temp agency, working for Abbott Laboratories. Sean went to work every day, faithfully, Monday through Friday, as he should.
Sean ended up having 2 children of his own. He was a great father, a devout father. He took a chapter out of his grandmother's book and worked really, really hard to provide for his 2 children. Even though Sean was the father of 2 young kids, he was still single. He was out there looking for love, and he just happened to find it through Lestine Robinson.
Lestine was 13 years older than Sean, who was 22 at the time, and she was the mother of his 16-year-old friend, Alram.
We were having a nice cookout, and they pulled up, and he wanted to be fed because Sean liked to eat. And that's pretty much how me and Sean got together, from that cookout. And I was worried about what people would think about me and Sean dating, and especially the fact that him and my son were so close. Eventually it came out, and I was embarrassed at first, but after a while, it's like, I ain't care. It was like, hey, I'm into Sean, and I want the world to know that I'm proud to be with Sean.
Lestine and Sean's relationship definitely took some getting used to from all parties involved.
Especially Alram, who eventually came to terms with his mom dating his friend.
It really does speak to how much respect he must have had for Sean, that he would give the stamp of approval for him to date his mom of all people.
Sean was at a turning point in his life. I was like, if you let me be your friend and you're a woman, I'm gonna show you we can go a long way, and I'm gonna support you and everything. And that's pretty much what I did. It was like, if he happy, I'm happy. And that was the goal, to keep each other happy.
Things were going so well in their relationship that Sean asked Lestine to move in with him and his brother in the Chicago suburb of Libertyville.
At that point, I knew things was gonna get serious between us. And I had started to base my future around Sean.
So Lestine's birthday was coming up on January 16th. She wanted to do something big to celebrate, so she and Sean decided they would come to Atlanta for her birthday weekend.
It was supposed to be a romantic weekend between Sean and I. And Alram's grandma wanted him to come down for the weekend. We agreed to pick Alram up and drop him off to his grandma's house in Atlanta.
They rented a car and decided to drive down from Chicago to Atlanta. They got a nice hotel in a very nice, safe area in Cobb County, Georgia.
After a long drive, Lestine and Sean dropped Alram off with his grandmother and checked into their hotel on the 14th.
We go up to the room. We didn't even brush our teeth or nothing. We was just thirsty to be in Atlanta, happy. It just felt so good to be in another city with my man.
But now, 3 days into their trip, Sean has suddenly gone missing.
You can only imagine how Lestine must have felt, where you go from being annoyed that your boyfriend isn't in the hotel room to now it seems clear that something may have happened to him.
They had called the police, and they were trying to calm me down. I just remember walking around the hotel looking for my man. I even walked up and down that lot.
As she gets closer to the rental car that they used to drive from Chicago to Atlanta, she realizes that there is blood spatter and smear on the side of the car. And that is really concerning to her.
I looked down, and then I saw the shell casings, and my heart got to pumping real fast.
She knows in that moment that something is terribly wrong.
Cobb County, Georgia police respond to a 911 call from Lestine Robinson about her boyfriend, Sean Gray.
The call initially came in as a missing person. So Lestine had called in and basically said she can't find her boyfriend.
I gave him all his information, everything that I could think of, from what he had on to his ID. I had all this stuff to his social security number.
Detectives asked when Lestine last saw Sean.
Right before they were about to doze off to go to sleep, Sean remembered that he left his bottle of water in their rental car. So he decided to get up out of bed and go back down to the parking garage.
They took my report and I walked them downstairs and I showed them where we was parked at.
There's blood in the parking deck near the vehicle, as well as shell casings. The water that Sean went down for was still inside the vehicle.
There was cash in the vehicle. I don't want a ton or anything, but there was cash in the vehicle on the floor.
The vehicle was locked and there was no damage to it. Immediately upon finding the shell casings as well as the blood, officers are taping off that scene, but we still don't necessarily know, was this a homicide? Was this a kidnapping?
And we searched the car, took pictures of it, processed it, did everything we could to see if there was any fingerprints or anything on it. We didn't find anything. There was blood on the other side of the wall, and I believe that's where all of the blood that we really saw in the parking deck.
One of the police officers happens to look over the edge of the parking garage and notices a body on the ground, on the embankment, lying there.
Before they can escort her away, Lestine sees him too.
I had saw Sean laying there, and he was laying there, stretched out, flat face on the ground. And at that moment, I felt like I lost everything. I couldn't even breathe.
Sean is pronounced dead at the scene. Closer inspection of his body reveals 4 gunshot wounds. This is a homicide.
Their next step was to question Lestine
Obviously knows is a murder investigation.
about what exactly was going on in their relationship the night of Sean Gray's disappearance and subsequent death.
So one of the first things you're going to want to know is, what was your timeline of events?
Where were y'all coming from?
Lestine was able to tell them that their weekend began when she and Sean drove down from Chicago with her son to celebrate her birthday for the weekend in Atlanta.
So it would have been Lestine, Alram, and Sean. Eventually that evening, they drop Alram off at his grandmother's house. So the next day is January 15th, and that's Lestine's actual birthday. So that morning, they go sightseeing.
They go back to the hotel, and I guess they had started partying a little bit. She ends up drinking too much, and she stays in that night. Sean goes out by himself, and he went to strip clubs.
The night before, he went to Magic City that Friday night. I didn't go with him Friday night.
The next morning, January 16th, this is now Saturday, and Lestine is extremely hungover. So they actually stay in bed almost the entire day, not leaving the hotel until around 6 o'clock in the evening.
They go have a great time, hit some clubs, get back to the hotel around 3 a.m.
We stopped at the gas station before we got here. We got out the car and got on the elevator and came up the stairs. I came in the room, he drank the juice, he had the apple juice. I got ready to get in the shower. He said he was going to the car to get the water. That's the last time I heard from him. He never came back.
After their interview with Lestine, detectives asked the hotel for the security camera recordings.
They go with the general manager to start reviewing the surveillance video.
Lestine and Sean, they park their car, and you see another car drive by and park around the way. Lestine and Sean go get in an elevator. They go up to their room. A little bit later, you actually see somebody walking along the wall of the parking deck, And they pass all these other cars, and they go up to Sean's car, his rental car. And they look inside the windows, and then they duck back behind the vehicle.
At 3:32 a.m., Sean walks back down to the car, and he's almost at his door when you actually see him kind of take a step back and look under the vehicle as though he heard something. Around that time, you see an individual coming out on the passenger side of his vehicle, and at some point they are actually face to face. And you can't tell whether any words are exchanged at that time, but they are staring at each other dead in the eyes for several seconds before Sean takes another step or two towards his vehicle.
That's when the shooter, he actually had his gun down by his leg already. When he came out, pulls it up, starts shooting.
You see Sean run and actually jump that small barricade as this individual is continuing to fire at him and actually reaches over the barricade to fire off several more rounds as Sean is trying to flee.
As the suspect is running away, you see this red Toyota Corolla pull up, stop. Suspect runs up to the door, pulls on it, gets in with a gun in his hand, and they drive off out of the parking deck.
No property was taken from Sean. He still had his wallet on his person when he was discovered. This is absolutely a targeted murder. It's clear from the evidence that this is targeted. So why Sean? Why Sean Gray?
Hotel security footage has given Cobb County detectives their first lead in the murder of Sean Gray. They think they're after at least two people, the shooter and the getaway driver.
So this was a very lucky case in the sense that officers were able to get a perfectly clear image of the tag of the red vehicle. Almost immediately, law enforcement is running the tag of that red vehicle, and it comes back to a woman who lives in Atlanta.
On the video, both the shooter and the driver appear to be men, so authorities focus on the registered owner's address.
So we look for every male that's associated with that address, and we find one guy that's old enough to be involved, to be as old as that guy was, and his name happens to be Ashley Davis. Once we had him identified, we took an arrest warrant. We started calling for assets to pick him up. But every SWAT team, the Marshal Service, Georgia State Patrol, anybody that could actually serve that arrest warrant for us, help us out, were all tasked out to the Capitol. They believed that there was going to be riots at the Capitol because of the election. So we actually had to wait 4 days.
Authorities used the time to learn more about Davis.
Investigators are able to use social media pages for their investigations. They're able to determine who people are communicating with, who their friends are, where they might have been at certain times and dates.
We know that our victim was from Chicago, had never been to Atlanta before. So Detective Knight is going through Ashley Davis's Facebook account to figure out what connection he might have to Chicago.
All of his little Facebook friends, all of his posts, there's one single connection with somebody from Chicago, and it's Jay Bracey. I don't know what his real name is, anything like that. So I reached out to some of the jurisdictions up around North Chicago area. I actually got in touch with one of their crime analysts. I sent them Jay Bracey's Facebook page.
While the Chicago crime analyst works on identifying Jay Bracey, authorities in Georgia finally take Ashley Davis into custody.
So January 21st, Ashley Davis is actually picked up by U.S. Marshals. He's brought to Cobb County Police Headquarters for an interview.
He claims he had nothing to do with the shooting.
Me and my girl were beefing, and she went out and messed with some dudes. I went out and tried to find, I ain't gonna lie, I was trying to solicit.
Okay.
I'm not gonna lie.
So, do you remember being in Cobb County?
No, I don't actually at that time, no.
Investigators get a search warrant for Davis's phone and find more incriminating evidence.
We do a phone extraction. And in doing so, Detective Knight noticed that there was some text message exchange around the time of our homicide where Ashley Davis is texting someone who's saved in his phone as Jay Chi-Town.
You start looking in the thread of those text messages between Ashley and this Jay number. And you see there's screenshots from the B-Way crew page where they've just arrived in Atlanta.
And there's a picture taken from the Courtyard Marriott where Sean Gray was staying and was discovered. Why is Jay Chi-Town sending a text of this screenshot from Facebook to Ashley Davis?
Gang squads in Chicago and Atlanta are not aware of the B-Way crew. So what is their connection?
In that extraction of Ashley's phone, probably 2.5 hours after the murder, you see him text Jay Chi-Town, "Hey, dump the line."
We found out that meant change your phone number, get rid of that phone line and get a new phone number. There was also several text messages about a tracker and where particular individuals were. And that really got Detective Knight's attention.
They had said delete the app with the tracker, made me think there was a GPS tracker. I saw the surveillance video where he's behind the car, so at that point we're like, maybe he was putting it on or taking it off, or I don't know.
By now, the crime analyst in Chicago thinks they have identified the man known as Jay Chi-Town and Jay Bracey. It could be a man named Jamar Bracey.
Jamar's actually served time in the Illinois State Penitentiary up there, and he's living in the Atlanta area now with his brother.
If Jamar Bracey and Ashley Davis were involved, who was the driver and who was the shooter? Now that they have a name, investigators dig into Bracey's phone records.
So we know we want a court order for those cell phone records, and we want to know where that device was at the time of our homicide.
Let's see, he's got location history right near where the victim is killed. And I also see he has location history where a gas station was, where I know my victim was. We found a car in his name, tag number, and we ran that tag number through our license plate reader system. And on the day that the victim got to town, Jamar Bracey's car was seen on tag readers in Cobb County around that hotel multiple times for several hours in that area.
Jamar Bracey was sitting at that hotel from 1 a.m. on Friday, January 15th until about 11:45 a.m. So you're talking about 10 and a half hours.
Who does that? Someone who is absolutely positively obsessed.
A haunting clue comes when analysts study Bracey's social media.
On a Facebook post he made just after the murder, he said, "Hurt me, I'll let karma do its job. Hurt my family, I'll become karma."
Cobb County detectives now have two suspects in the murder of Sean Gray, Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey. They hope Sean's girlfriend, Lestine Robinson, can help them understand the mysterious B-Way crew.
I asked her to come in for another interview. I asked her to go through the timeline again, which she did exactly the same as she did before. Oh, she's very, very consistent.
Your son, you go by like Broadway something?
B-Way crew, it's like 6 of them on that Facebook page.
Lestine explains the B-Way crew is a small group her son Alram created with friends back in Chicago, and it seems Jamar Bracey had it out for them.
I did a search warrant on their Facebook page. In that search warrant, I got their message contents. And one of the conversations was between the B-Way crew page and Jay Bracey. Jay Bracey messages them, "Hey, I need to know who shot my nephew."
Turns out there was a drive-by shooting in Chicago on January 6th, 11 days before Sean was killed.
Chicago Police Department informs Cobb County Police that drive-by shooting involved 16-year-old Brandon Walker being shot in the neck. Brandon Walker is actually Jamar Bracey's nephew. Although there is some significant and permanent damage, he does end up surviving.
Jamar Bracey wanted to find all of the correlations and all of the potential players that may have been involved in this drive-by on his nephew.
The messages reveal Bracey believed the B-Way crew and Lestein's son, Alram, were tied to the drive-by when he saw a photo Alram posted that showed the apartment complex where the shooting took place.
Now, Alram was a big Facebooker, and prior to him and his mother and Sean moving out to Libertyville, Illinois, he took a picture of his mother's front door in his old neighborhood and posted it to Facebook.
Seeing that photo, Bracey messaged Alram to confront him.
Alram vehemently denied having anything to do with the drive-by shooting, telling Jamar that he had moved from that apartment complex, he was not there, he has no idea who was involved with it.
Authorities also find messages sent to Alram by Jamar Bracey's sister, Kirby Bracey Walker, the mother of the drive-by shooting victim.
Kirby Walker did reach out to Alram on Facebook to question him about what exactly happened the night of the drive-by as well.
They're responding saying, we used to live there. Why would we shoot up our former residence? That doesn't make any sense.
But then Jamar began questioning him about, well, if you didn't do it, who did? I need their information. I want to contact them. I need to know who was involved in this drive-by.
At that point, B-Way crew is like, yo, man, pump the brakes. You're asking way too many questions. I'm out. I don't want to have this conversation anymore.
So Alram quits responding, just chalks it up to a weird interaction, and keeps using Facebook like normal.
The Facebook warrant also reveals Alram was the one who posted the photo outside the hotel, never realizing what Bracey might do with it.
Not even an hour after Sean, Lestein, and Alram arrive at the hotel, Jamar Bracey sends that screenshot of the post that they've arrived in Atlanta to Ashley Davis. So now Detective Knight sees, okay, some sort of shooting happened in January of 2021, about 11 days before our murder, and all of a sudden Jamar Bracey is in Atlanta committing a murder of this guy, Sean Gray, who's from Chicago. So how does this fit together?
Investigators think that when Jamar couldn't get information from Alram, he decided to target him.
Jamar now feels like he needs to get to the bottom of what happened.
He was fueled by revenge, and he was gonna get payback for his nephew.
Investigating the murder of Sean Gray, Georgia police believe the getaway driver was Ashley Davis, whom they have in custody. Now, they're after the alleged shooter, Jamar Bracey.
Detective Knight took an arrest warrant for Jamar Bracey, charging him with the murder of Sean Gray. And on February 24th of 2021, U.S. Marshals located him in North Carolina, where he was taken into custody.
I went to DeKalb County and interviewed him at the jail, which once I started asking him about Cobb County, he said he didn't have anything he wanted to talk about and asked for a lawyer.
I don't know if I should be going to tell I have a lawyer.
That's up to you, man.
Yeah, I think I want a lawyer.
They don't want to talk to me, cool, whatever. But I'm going to listen to your jail calls anyway. And you say some interesting things on there, like talking about his blood, which is Ashley Davis.
Hey, do me a favor. No. All my social medias, don't get in no inboxes on them. Don't make no comment, don't talk about nothing. Yeah? Yeah. They trying to put a first-degree murder on me just from a free blood post. I'm gonna sue the shit out of these.
And at one point, he gives his Google account information.
At this point, Detective Knight got a court order for Jamar Bracey's Google records. If you have an Android device, you're required to have a Gmail account in order to set up the phone. And from there, Google is tracking everything that you do. In going through those Google records, we also find an email from Optimus. Now, Optimus is a company that provides tracking services, and they have an app associated where you can actually be keeping tabs of the tracking device, seeing where it is on your cell phone. So we see an email where Jamar Bracey is actually signing up for that tracking service.
It took me about a week and I got a search warrant for Optimus GPS tracking and all their history.
The police were able to determine that Lestine and Sean's vehicle had been being tracked since the day after they arrived in Atlanta.
Al Rom is the one that posted on B-Way Crew saying, "We in the A," indicating that Sean, Lestine, and Al Rom had arrived in Atlanta. Jamar Bracey was hunting them. What he didn't realize is that Al Rom went to stay with his grandmother and he ended up stalking Lestine and Sean instead. Jamar Bracey put the Optimus tracker on the vehicle rented by Sean Gray. Jamar Bracey is tracing and stalking and hunting our victim every step of the way.
At one point, Bracey thinks he might have been spotted, so he has Ashley Davis drive him in Davis's mother's car.
That evening, on Saturday, January 16th, Jamar Bracey again goes to Ashley Davis's residence. And it's there that they get in the vehicle together and actually follow behind physically for 3.5 hours Sean Gray and Lestine Robinson.
On the way back to their hotel, Sean and Lestine stopped for gas.
I was like, I have to go to this gas station. I gotta see if we got some video here. So I get there and sure enough, I get video of Sean Gray pulling up in his Mitsubishi Outlander. He gets out and he checks the car and he goes inside the gas station. He buys his Voss water. He goes back out to the car. Right about when he's getting in the car, here comes Ashley Davis.
Jamar Bracey and Ashley Davis were sitting right next to Sean and Lestine at the gas pumps minutes before he was murdered.
And right when they pull up, Sean drives off.
At this point, it's about 3:11 in the morning, and they are heading back now to the hotel, which is right around the corner from that Marathon gas station. At 3:21 a.m., you then see this red sedan pull into the parking deck.
When Sean comes back to his car at 3:30 a.m., he is met with Jamar Bracey pulling a gun, firing on him in cold blood.
But I had told him I wasn't gonna fall asleep. But I ended up falling asleep. He was coming right back. So I thought. But the whole time my man was laying just on the opposite of the hotel dead.
The records show Bracey reached out to his sister right after the shooting.
13 minutes after this murder, Kirby Bracey Walker texts her brother Jamar Bracey and says, "Erase everything, bro. Get home safe. I love you."
Investigators considered charging Bracey's sister as an accessory, but instead, they get her to agree to testify against him.
But he ended up getting charged with malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, and then aggravated assault and the possession of a firearm.
The question is whether the evidence will be enough to convict Bracey.
A defense team only really has to interject doubt into the minds of the jurors. They don't necessarily have to prove their case. All they have to do is interject reasonable doubt into the jurors' minds.
6 months after their arrests, Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey are set to stand trial for the murder of Sean Gray.
Jamar Bracey's defense attorneys filed a speedy trial demand, and with that means Jamar Bracey and Ashley Davis as co-defendants are going to trial together in September.
Weeks before the trial, Davis surprises everyone by pleading guilty.
Evidently, Ashley was afraid of Jamar. He did not want to speak about Jamar. He didn't want to talk about it. And he even asked to go into protective custody at the jail. Ashley did plead guilty. He got a life sentence. Jamar refused to take any deal and decided he wanted to go to trial.
Trial began on September 13th, 2021 at the Cobb County Superior Courthouse.
Jamar never made one eye contact with me, not one. He never looked at me. He held his head down the whole time.
The key piece of evidence for the prosecutors was the surveillance video from the hotel cameras the night that Sean Gray was killed.
Nobody doubted what the video showed, but we really needed evidence to show that the person on video was Jamar Bracey. It was clearly such a targeted murder that you want to know why. And it almost doesn't make sense if you don't know why.
So the goal of the prosecution was not just to make sure that they painted Jamar Bracey as the man that was actually on the surveillance video the night that Sean Gray was killed. They wanted to make sure that the jury had the full picture of Jamar Bracey as a man who was very determined to exact revenge.
I really wanted an expert to be able to show the overlay between all of these records to show how Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey were truly stalking and hunting Sean Gray. So the expert we hired was actually able to put together an animation that showed the Optimus tracker records coupled with Ashley Davis's records and Jamar Bracey's records. And it was almost like a cat and mouse game where you would see the Optimus tracker moving along, and at the same time, right behind the Optimus tracker were Ashley Davis and Jamar Bracey. This was absolutely a revenge killing where he hunted and stalked Sean Gray, ultimately leading to his death.
But the aim of Bracey's revenge was off.
His amateur sleuthing led him to the wrong person. He had no idea that Sean Gray was not Al Rom and was not any member associated with B-Way Crew. He never cared to put two and two together.
Bracey's lawyers present a different theory, one meant to plant a crucial seed of doubt.
Jamar Bracey had a twin brother, and during the defense, they wanted to allude to the fact that perhaps Jamar Bracey's twin brother had his cell phone during this time period. They didn't want to go as far as saying Jamar Bracey's twin brother committed the murder, but they certainly were trying to get the phone out of Jamar Bracey's hand.
I guess it was their case to say that Jamar wasn't the person who committed the murder, but the jurors did not buy anything that he was selling.
On September 21st, 2021, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts.
The judge sentences Jamar Bracey to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
I don't believe that they charged anybody with his nephew's shooting. If you really sum it up, the whole case was about revenge. Jamar tried to get revenge for his nephew's shooting, but he got revenge against the wrong person.
We'll never get Sean back, but this man won't be able to see the light of day again. He'll never be able to hurt nobody else. And that's what made me feel good, to know that he's off the streets. And he'll never, ever, ever be able to take another life. I never want a family to go through what we had to go through. Me and my kids, we speak about Sean every day. And we miss you, Sean.
October 12, 1984. The autumn air over Queensville, Ontario, carried the familiar scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. It was the kind of small Canadian town where people still waved at each other for driveways, where children rode bicycles without fear, and where parents believed their neighborhoods were safe enough for their sons and daughters to walk a few blocks alone. At first glance, nothing about that Friday seemed destined to become one of the darkest days in Canadian criminal history. The sky hung low beneath a blanket of gray clouds. A cool breeze moved through the trees, lining the quiet roads. Families followed their normal routines. Cars pulled into driveways after work. School buses rolled through residential streets. Dogs barked behind wooden fences. Life moved exactly as it always had. Then a little girl disappeared. 9-year-old Christine Jessup left her home, intending to make a short trip to a nearby store. It was an ordinary errand, the kind of task children completed every day without anyone thinking twice. She never came home. At first, nobody panicked. Perhaps she had stopped to talk with a friend. Perhaps she had taken a longer route. Perhaps she had wandered into a neighbor's yard. Minutes became hours. Hours became an evening filled with growing concern. By nightfall, concern had transformed into fear. The Jessup family began making phone calls. Neighbors joined the search. Flashlights appeared in the darkness. Volunteers walked roadsides and empty lots. People called Christine's name into fields and wooded areas. There was no answer. The little girl had vanished. What happened next would leave scars not only on one family, but on an entire nation. And yet, this is not merely the story of a murdered child. It is not merely the story of a police investigation. It is not merely the story of a courtroom battle. This is the story of what happens when certainty becomes more powerful than truth. Because while investigators desperately searched for Christine Jessup's killer, another tragedy was quietly beginning. A tragedy that would unfold over more than a decade. A tragedy that would destroy the life of an innocent man. Years later, when people looked back on the case, many would remember the horrifying crime. Others would remember the controversial trials. But perhaps the most haunting question would be this: how does an innocent person become a murderer in the eyes of an entire country? The answer begins in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Among the residents living near the Jessup family was a man named Guy Paul Morin. At the time, Morin was not a criminal. He was not known for violence. He was not hiding dark secrets. He was simply different. And sometimes different can be enough. Morin was a quiet man, reserved, introverted. While many of his neighbors spent evenings socializing, he often preferred solitude. He loved music. The clarinet occupied much of his free time. He could spend hours practicing alone. The instrument's notes drifted through windows while the rest of the neighborhood carried on with ordinary life. To some people, he seemed awkward. To others, he seemed eccentric. He wasn't the kind of person who naturally drew crowds. He didn't dominate conversations. He didn't seek attention. And in a small community, people often notice those who stand apart. Not because they have done anything wrong, simply because they do not fit comfortably into expectations. At the time, nobody could have imagined how significant those perceptions would become. Because as the search for Christine intensified, pressure began building on investigators. The disappearance of a child creates a unique kind of urgency. Every hour matters. Every lead feels important. Every unanswered question becomes unbearable. Police officers worked around the clock. Search teams expanded. Volunteers combed fields and forests. Roadblocks were established. Tips poured in from worried citizens. Yet Christine remained missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Autumn gave way to winter. The leaves disappeared. Snow covered the landscape. The hope that Christine might still be alive began to fade. Families who had once left doors unlocked started checking them twice. Parents became more protective. Children who previously wandered freely were suddenly escorted everywhere. The disappearance transformed the atmosphere of the community. Fear moved quietly through the town. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent, like a shadow stretching longer every day. Then came New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1984. While much of Canada prepared to welcome a new year, investigators received devastating news. A body had been found. The discovery occurred approximately 50 kilometers from Christine's home. The location was remote, cold, silent. Snow covered much of the surrounding area. What searchers found there ended months of uncertainty and began a nightmare that would last decades. The remains were identified as Christine Jessup. The little girl who had vanished in October had finally been found. But the answers everyone desperately wanted did not arrive with her discovery. Instead, investigators uncovered evidence that suggested a brutal and deeply disturbing crime. The details shocked even experienced officers. The community was devastated. Parents cried for a child many had never personally known. Children heard whispered conversations they could not fully understand. Teachers struggled to comfort frightened students. The murder became headline news. Television stations covered every development. Newspapers published updates almost daily. Across Ontario, people followed the case. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. Most of all, they wanted someone held responsible. That desire is understandable. When a child is murdered, society instinctively seeks accountability. Someone must have done this. Someone must pay. Someone must be found. And that is where danger sometimes begins. Because the search for a killer can gradually become something else. A search for certainty. A search for closure. A search for a suspect who makes the story feel complete. Investigators began examining everyone connected to Christine's life. Neighbors, friends, family acquaintances, residents living nearby, anyone who might have crossed paths with her. Among those individuals was Guy Paul Morin. Initially, he was simply one of many people questioned. Nothing more, nothing less. But over time, attention began to focus increasingly on him. He lived nearby. He knew the neighborhood. His personality stood out. His habits seemed unusual to some observers. Little details that might have appeared meaningless under different circumstances suddenly attracted scrutiny. People began remembering things, or believing they remembered things. Someone thought they had seen him. Another person recalled a conversation. Others mentioned behavior that seemed odd. Individually, these observations meant very little. Together, they started forming a narrative. And narratives can become powerful, especially when investigators are searching desperately for answers. As months passed, the spotlight on Morin intensified. The public largely remained unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. Most Canadians simply assumed police were steadily progressing towards solving the murder. But inside the investigation, a subtle shift had begun. Instead of asking who committed the crime, attention increasingly focused on proving that one particular person had committed it. The distinction may seem small. In reality, it changes everything. Because once investigators become convinced they have found the right suspect, every piece of information can begin appearing through that lens. Evidence that supports the theory receives attention. Evidence that challenges the theory may seem less important. Questions become assumptions. Possibilities become conclusions. And the danger grows. For Guy Paul Morin, the consequences would be catastrophic. He did not know it yet. The country did not know it yet. Even many investigators did not fully realize what was happening. But a path had been set in motion. A path leading toward courtrooms, prison cells, public condemnation, years of suffering, and one of the most infamous wrongful convictions in Canadian history. The tragedy of Christine Jessup's murder was already heartbreaking. What followed would reveal an entirely different tragedy unfolding alongside it, one involving flawed assumptions, questionable forensic conclusions, witness memories shaped by time and pressure, and a justice system convinced it had found the right man. Long before DNA technology would expose the truth, long before apologies would be issued, long before official inquiries would uncover devastating mistakes. There was simply a grieving family searching for answers, a frightened community demanding justice, a police investigation narrowing its focus, and a quiet musician living an ordinary life, a life that was about to change forever. Because in the weeks and months ahead, Guy Paul Morin would slowly transform from neighbor to suspect, from suspect to accused, from accused to convicted murderer. Not because the evidence truly proved his guilt, but because an entire system would come to believe it did. And once that belief takes hold, overturning it can become harder than anyone imagines. The story of Christine Jessup's murder had already broken hearts across Canada. The story of Guy Paul Morin's nightmare was only beginning. Queensville in the mid-1980s was the kind of place that rarely appeared in national headlines. Nestled within the rural landscape of Ontario, it was a community where seasons dictated the rhythm of life. In spring, melting snow fed narrow streams running through fields and wooded areas. Summer brought long evenings filled with the sounds of lawn mowers, children riding bicycles, and neighbors chatting from front porches. Autumn painted the countryside in deep shades of orange and gold. Winter wrapped everything beneath a blanket of snow that seemed to soften every sound. People knew each other there, not necessarily in the way cities imagine small towns, where everyone knows every detail of everyone else's life, but in a quieter, more practical way. Faces were familiar. Cars were recognizable. Children often played together regardless of which street they lived on. If someone needed help repairing a fence or digging a vehicle out of a snowbank, assistance was usually only a phone call away. It was the kind of environment where parents felt comfortable allowing their children a degree of independence. That sense of safety was one of the reasons the disappearance of Christine Jessup struck the community so deeply. The crime felt impossible, not because terrible things never happen in Canada, but because terrible things were not supposed to happen here. The weeks following Christine's disappearance transformed Queensville. At first, people operated on hope. Volunteers organized search parties. Local residents walked through fields carrying flashlights. Farmers checked remote sections of their property. Hunters explored wooded areas they knew better than anyone else. Police officers followed tips that ranged from promising to completely implausible. Every possible lead seemed worth pursuing. Every report generated another burst of optimism. Someone thought they had seen a child matching Christine's description. Someone heard about a suspicious vehicle. Someone remembered an unfamiliar person in the area. Investigators chased each possibility. One by one, they led nowhere. As autumn gave way to winter, hope slowly became uncertainty. The Jessup family endured a kind of suffering that is difficult to describe. Unlike families who receive immediate answers after tragedy, they were trapped inside a state of permanent waiting. Every telephone call mattered. Every knock on the door created anxiety. Every day began with the possibility that Christine might somehow be found alive. Every night ended without answers. The emotional exhaustion accumulated slowly. Friends and neighbors wanted to help, but no one knew what to say. How do you comfort parents when nobody knows whether their child is alive or dead? How do you encourage hope without creating false expectations? The uncertainty became its own form of torture. Meanwhile, the investigation continued expanding. Detectives examined hundreds of potential leads. They interviewed neighbors repeatedly. Maps covered office walls. Timelines were created and revised. Every movement Christine might have made on the day she vanished was analyzed. Every possible encounter was scrutinized. The pressure on investigators was immense. The murder of a child creates public attention unlike almost any other crime. People want answers. Politicians want answers. Journalists want answers. Families desperately need answers. And with every passing week, the expectation grows stronger. Find a person responsible. Bring justice to the victim. Solve the case. By the time Christine's body was discovered on December 31st, the investigation entered an entirely new phase. The uncertainty surrounding whether she was alive ended. The search for her killer intensified. The discovery site presented investigators with a grim reality. Snow covered much of the landscape. The surrounding area appeared isolated and silent. The kind of location most people would drive past without giving a second glance. Yet somewhere within that cold winter setting lay evidence that detectives hoped would identify a murderer. Forensic investigators carefully examined the scene. Photographs were taken. Samples were collected. Measurements were recorded. Every detail mattered. Technology in the mid-1980s was far different from what investigators possess today. Modern DNA databases did not yet exist in practical criminal investigations. Digital evidence was non-existent. Cell phone records were not available because mobile phones were not part of everyday life. Investigators relied heavily on witness statements, physical evidence, forensic interpretation, and traditional detective work. Each piece of evidence carried enormous importance. At the same time, each piece carried the risk of misinterpretation. The murder quickly became one of the most significant criminal investigations in Ontario. Media coverage intensified. Television cameras arrived. Newspaper reporters followed developments closely. The public's desire for answers became almost overwhelming. People wanted to know who could commit such a crime. More importantly, they wanted reassurance that the killer would be caught. As investigators examined Christine's life, they naturally focused on individuals who lived nearby. This process is common in homicide investigations. Statistically, victims often know their killers. Family members, acquaintances, neighbors, and friends are frequently examined before attention shifts elsewhere. Among those living in the area was Guy Paul Morin. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about his involvement. Police interviewed numerous local residents. Morin was simply one of many. Yet something about him gradually attracted attention. Perhaps it was his personality. Perhaps it was the way he interacted with investigators. Perhaps it was a combination of factors that seemed insignificant individually but appeared meaningful when viewed together. Morin was not the sort of person who immediately put strangers at ease. He was intelligent but socially awkward, soft-spoken, introverted, more comfortable discussing music than engaging in casual conversation. People often misunderstand introverted personalities, especially during periods of heightened fear. When communities search for explanations after traumatic events, unusual behavior can suddenly appear suspicious. A person who enjoys solitude may seem secretive. A person who struggles socially may appear evasive. A person who reacts nervously during questioning may seem deceptive. Human beings are remarkably skilled at finding patterns. Sometimes those patterns are real. Sometimes they exist only because we expect them to exist. As the investigation progressed, rumors began circulating throughout the community. Rumors are almost inevitable in high-profile cases. They travel quickly. They evolve constantly. They often become more dramatic with each retelling. People discussed possible suspects over kitchen tables. Conversations unfolded in grocery stores. Co-workers debated theories during lunch breaks. The murder became part of everyday life. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. Everyone wanted certainty. For investigators, separating fact from speculation became increasingly difficult. Witnesses often believe they remember events more clearly than they actually do. Memories are not recordings. They are reconstructions. Each time a memory is recalled, it can be subtly altered. New information can influence old recollections. Repeated questioning can strengthen confidence without improving accuracy. This would eventually become one of the most important aspects of the case, because several witnesses began providing information that appeared to point toward Morin. Initially, some accounts were uncertain. People expressed doubts. Details seemed vague, but over time, certainty increased. Individuals who once hesitated became more confident. Memories appeared stronger. Descriptions seemed clearer. To investigators eager for progress, these developments looked promising. To later reviewers, they would become deeply troubling. The case against Morin was not built upon one dramatic piece of evidence. There was no eyewitness who directly observed the murder. There was no confession. There was no definitive forensic proof. Instead, suspicion grew gradually, layer by layer, inference upon inference, assumption upon assumption. At the center of everything stood a man who continued living his life while investigators examined his every action. Morin spent much of his free time practicing clarinet. Music offered structure and comfort. While the rest of the community wrestled with fear and uncertainty, he found refuge in familiar routines. But the world around him was changing. People began looking at him differently. Conversations felt different. Interactions felt strained. The invisible weight of suspicion was already beginning to settle over his life. He may not have fully understood its magnitude yet, but others were starting to draw conclusions. And once suspicion enters public consciousness, it develops momentum of its own. The media played a significant role in shaping perceptions. Journalists reported developments as they emerged. The public consumed every update. The desire for a resolution often overshadowed the complexity of the investigation. People wanted the story to make sense. A murdered child, a suspect, an arrest, a conviction, a conclusion. Human beings naturally seek narratives with clear endings. Reality is often far messier. As months passed, the investigation narrowed. Resources increasingly focused on specific theories. Alternative possibilities received less attention. What began as an open search for answers slowly transformed into something more concentrated. The phenomenon would later become known by a term that criminal justice experts frequently discuss: tunnel vision. Tunnel vision occurs when investigators become convinced of suspects' guilt and begin interpreting information through that belief. Contradictory evidence receives less weight. Ambiguous evidence appears incriminating. Alternative explanations fade into the background. The process is rarely malicious. Most often, it develops gradually and unintentionally. The investigators involved in the Jessup case believed they were pursuing justice. They believed they were protecting the community. They believed they were moving closer to solving a horrific crime. Yet unknown to them, they may have already started moving away from the truth. The tragedy of Christine Jessup's murder had created enormous pressure. The community demanded answers. The media demanded progress. The family deserved justice. Under those conditions, certainty can become dangerously attractive. And certainty was exactly what investigators believed they were finding. As winter faded and another year approached, the focus on Guy Paul Morin continued growing. The quiet musician who once blended into the background of Queensville was becoming the center of one of Canada's most significant criminal investigations. His life was about to enter a storm unlike anything he could have imagined. The machinery of the justice system was beginning to move. Detectives were gathering evidence. Prosecutors were reviewing information. Witnesses were being interviewed. The public was watching. And somewhere behind all the assumptions, all the theories, and all the growing confidence, the real killer remained unidentified, waiting, unknown, invisible, while an innocent man's future slowly began slipping out of his hands. Before the name Guy Paul Morin became associated with one of the most notorious wrongful convictions in Canadian history, he was simply a man living a quiet life in rural Ontario. There was nothing dramatic about his daily routine, nothing that would attract headlines. Nothing that suggested he would one day become the focus of a murder investigation that would consume years of his life. If someone had driven through Queensville during the early 1980s and passed Morin on the street, they probably would not have remembered him afterward. He was not loud. He was not charismatic. He was not the kind of person who commanded attention when he entered a room. In many ways, he seemed almost invisible. And perhaps that invisibility would later become one of his greatest vulnerabilities. Morin lived a life built around routines. He enjoyed structure, predictability, solitude. While many people filled their evenings with social gatherings or community events, he often preferred spending time alone. There was comfort in familiar habits, comfort in activities that did not require navigating the complexities of social interaction. Music occupied a special place in his world. The clarinet was more than a hobby. It was a refuge. Hours could disappear while he practiced. Notes flowed through rooms that otherwise remained quiet. Music offered certainty. Every scale had a correct sequence. Every composition followed its own logic. Unlike people, music was predictable. Neighbors occasionally heard those melodies drifting through open windows. For some, it was simply background noise. For Morin, it was a language that felt easier to understand than ordinary conversation. Those who knew him often described him as shy, introverted, reserved. He was not antisocial. He simply moved through the world differently than many people around him. Small talk did not come naturally. Large gatherings could feel exhausting. Interactions that others considered routine sometimes made him uncomfortable. Today, such characteristics might be recognized as personality traits that exist across a broad spectrum of human behavior. But in the mid-1980s, particularly within smaller communities, people who seemed different were often viewed with suspicion. Not hostility, not hatred, just uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of growing when fear enters the picture. When Christine Jessup disappeared, the entire community began searching for explanations. People looked around at those they knew. They considered possibilities. They replayed conversations and memories. They searched for something that would make the crime understandable. A terrible crime demands a terrible explanation. That is often how people think. Unfortunately, reality rarely follows such simple rules. Long before police focused heavily on him, Morin was already different enough to stand apart. He lived alone. He spent considerable time by himself. His hobbies seemed unusual to some. His mannerisms sometimes appeared awkward. When investigators began interviewing residents, those differences suddenly became magnified. A neighbor who once seemed merely eccentric could begin appearing suspicious. An awkward conversation could become significant. An unusual habit could become evidence in the minds of observers. This transformation often happens slowly. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides an innocent person is guilty. Instead, perceptions shift little by little. Each new detail seems to confirm earlier assumptions. Each coincidence appears meaningful. Each ambiguity becomes evidence of something darker. As detectives continued investigating Christine's murder, they naturally examined people who lived nearby. Morin's proximity to the victim placed him within that circle. Initially, he cooperated. Like many residents, he answered questions, provided information, participated in the process. He believed investigators were searching for the person responsible for a terrible crime. What he did not realize was that investigators were gradually beginning to focus on him. The more they examined his life, the more they noticed details that seemed unusual. His reserved personality, his solitary lifestyle, his hobbies, his behavior during questioning. None of these things constituted proof of anything. Yet collectively, they began creating an image. And images can be powerful, especially when people are desperate for answers. The irony is that many characteristics later used to cast suspicion upon Morin were the same characteristics he had displayed for years. Nothing had changed. Only the interpretation had changed. A quiet man practicing clarinet became a quiet man practicing clarinet near the home of a murdered child. A reserved neighbor became a reserved neighbor under investigation. An introvert became a possible suspect. The facts remained the same. The stories surrounding those facts evolved. Meanwhile, another victim's story continued unfolding alongside Morin's. Christine Jessup had been only 9 years old. 9. An age when childhood still feels limitless. An age when afternoons stretch endlessly and the future seems impossibly distant. Family photographs captured smiles that now carried heartbreaking significance. Ordinary moments became treasured memories. A birthday celebration, a school event, a casual family gathering. Things that once seemed routine suddenly became irreplaceable. For Christine's family, grief existed alongside unanswered questions. The pain of losing a child is devastating under any circumstances. But losing a child to violence creates additional wounds. Questions become permanent companions. What happened? Was she frightened? Did she suffer? Could anything have been done differently? Those questions haunted the people who loved her. Every new development in the investigation brought hope. Every setback brought frustration. As years passed, the need for answers only grew stronger. The public often remembers high-profile criminal cases through headlines and court decisions. What gets forgotten are the countless ordinary moments stolen from families. The empty chair at a dinner table. The birthdays that never arrive. The milestones that never happen. For Christine's parents, life became divided into two periods. Before October 12, 1984, and after, everything changed. The search for justice became intertwined with the search for peace. Unfortunately, the pursuit of justice does not always lead directly to truth. As investigators concentrated increasingly on Morin, public perception began shifting as well. Media coverage intensified. Stories emphasized details that appeared suspicious. Speculation filled gaps where evidence remained uncertain. The image of a potential suspect slowly formed. For many people watching from afar, the narrative seemed convincing. A child had been murdered. Police had identified someone they believed responsible. The story felt complete. Yet beneath the surface, serious problems were emerging. Witness memories became a central component of the investigation. Human memory is remarkably fragile. People often believe their recollections function like video recordings. In reality, memory is reconstructive. It changes, adapts, incorporates new information. A witness who initially expresses uncertainty may later develop confidence. That confidence does not necessarily reflect accuracy. Sometimes it reflects repetition. Sometimes it reflects suggestion. Sometimes it reflects the natural human desire to help solve a tragedy. Several witnesses connected to the investigation experienced exactly this phenomenon. Statements evolved. Details shifted. Certainty increased. Investigators interpreted these developments as strengthening evidence. Years later, critics would view them very differently. At the same time, forensic science played an increasingly important role. During the 1980s, many forensic disciplines enjoyed immense credibility. Jurors trusted expert testimony. Judges trusted expert testimony. Police trusted expert testimony. Scientific evidence carried enormous weight. Yet many techniques considered reliable at the time would later face serious criticism. Hair comparison analysis, fiber examination, pattern interpretation. Methods once presented with confidence often lacked rigorous scientific validation. In the Jessup investigation, several forensic conclusions appeared to support the theory that Morin was responsible. These conclusions strengthened investigators' beliefs. They strengthened prosecutors' beliefs. Eventually, they strengthened public beliefs. What few people realized was that some of these findings rested upon shaky foundations. Years later, many would be re-examined. Some would be discredited. Others would be viewed as deeply misleading. But during the investigation itself, they seemed persuasive. The case against Morin continued growing. Not through one decisive breakthrough, not through a confession, not through definitive physical evidence. Instead, through accumulation. One observation here, one witness statement there, one forensic interpretation added to another, like individual threads woven together into a rope. The problem was that many of those threads were weak. Yet when enough weak threads are combined, they can appear remarkably strong. As pressure mounted, Morin found himself living beneath an increasingly dark cloud. Friends noticed changes. Interactions became awkward. Rumors spread. The sense that something was wrong became impossible to ignore. Imagine waking each morning knowing investigators suspect you of murdering a child. Imagine watching neighbors look at you differently. Imagine hearing whispers without knowing exactly what is being said. The psychological burden must have been immense. Yet this was only the beginning. The most difficult years still lay ahead. The machinery of prosecution was gathering momentum. Detectives believed they were building a compelling case. Prosecutors reviewed evidence. Experts prepared reports. Witnesses refined their recollections. The foundation for a criminal trial was taking shape. For Christine's family, these developments brought cautious optimism. Perhaps justice was approaching. Perhaps the nightmare would finally end. Perhaps the person responsible would soon be held accountable. Those hopes were understandable, natural, human. The tragedy is that the wrong person stood at the center of that process. The real killer remained unidentified, unknown to investigators, unknown to prosecutors, unknown to the public. While attention focused increasingly on Guy Paul Morin, the truth remained hidden somewhere beyond the boundaries of the investigation. Years would pass before science exposed that reality. Years would pass before DNA technology revealed what countless assumptions had concealed. But at this stage of the story, none of that was visible. There was only a grieving family, a frightened community, an investigation narrowing toward a single suspect, and a quiet musician whose life was gradually being transformed into something he could neither control nor escape. The next chapter would move from suspicion to accusation, from theory to prosecution, from doubt to certainty. A certainty that would ultimately send an innocent man into one of the darkest periods of his life. Christine Jessop avait 9 ans. 9 petites années seulement. Un âge où le monde paraît encore immense, où les routes de campagne ressemblent à des aventures, où une simple promenade jusqu'au magasin du coin ne semble représenter aucun danger. Le matin du 12 octobre 1984, personne dans la petite communauté de Kingsville, en Ontario, n'aurait pu imaginer que cette journée allait devenir l'une des plus tragiques de l'histoire criminelle canadienne. Le ciel d'automne était clair. Les arbres qui entouraient les routes rurales portaient encore des feuilles jaunes et rouges qui tremblaient doucement sous le vent. Les habitants poursuivaient leurs habitudes quotidiennes. Les enfants revenaient de l'école. Les adultes travaillaient ou préparaient le week-end à venir. Rien ne semblait différent. Rien ne laissait présager qu'une famille allait bientôt basculer dans un cauchemar sans fin. Christine était sortie de chez elle avec une mission simple. Une tâche banale qu'un enfant de son âge pouvait accomplir sans inquiétude. Dans cette région tranquille, les parents n'imaginaient pas que le danger puisse se cacher derrière chaque arbre ou chaque virage. Kingsville n'était pas une grande ville. C'était le genre d'endroit où les voisins se connaissaient, où les portes restaient parfois déverrouillées, où les enfants jouaient dehors jusqu'au coucher du soleil. La confiance faisait partie du quotidien. Lorsque les heures commencèrent à passer et que Christine ne rentra pas à la maison, l'inquiétude remplaça peu à peu la normalité. Au début, sa famille chercha des explications simples. Peut-être avait-elle rendu visite à une amie. Peut-être avait-elle pris un chemin différent. Peut-être avait-elle perdu la notion du temps. Mais les minutes se transformèrent en heures, et les heures devinrent une angoisse grandissante qui s'installait dans chaque pièce de la maison. Les appels commencèrent. Les voisins furent contactés. Les amis furent interrogés. Personne n'avait vu Christine revenir. Personne ne savait où elle se trouvait. À mesure que le soleil descendait derrière les arbres, une peur nouvelle prit forme. Une peur que tous les parents connaissent mais refusent d'imaginer. Une peur qui serre la poitrine et empêche de respirer normalement. La police fut alertée. Très rapidement, la disparition d'une petite fille transforma toute la communauté. Les jours suivants furent marqués par des recherches intensives. Des centaines de bénévoles parcoururent les champs, les fossés, les sentiers forestiers et les routes rurales. Des équipes organisées avancèrent lentement à travers les bois. Les bottes écrasaient les feuilles mortes. Les lampes éclairaient les sous-bois. Chaque objet aperçu dans la végétation provoquait un bref espoir suivi d'une déception. Partout, les affiches de Christine apparurent. Son visage souriant était affiché sur les vitrines, les poteaux électriques et les tableaux communautaires. Les habitants observaient cette photographie avec une émotion particulière. Chaque parent voyait son propre enfant dans ce sourire. Chaque jour sans réponse rendait la situation plus inquiétante. Les semaines passèrent. Puis un mois. Puis un autre. L'automne céda progressivement sa place à l'hiver. Les températures chutèrent. Les arbres se retrouvèrent nus. La neige commença à recouvrir certaines parties de la campagne ontarienne. Et pourtant, Christine demeurait introuvable. Pour sa famille, le temps semblait s'être arrêté. L'espoir et le désespoir se livraient une bataille constante. Chaque coup de téléphone pouvait être la réponse attendue. Chaque véhicule qui s'arrêtait devant la maison pouvait apporter une nouvelle. Mais rien ne venait. Pendant ce temps, les enquêteurs tentaient de comprendre ce qui avait pu arriver. Ils examinaient les témoignages. Ils retraçaient les déplacements de la fillette. Ils interrogeaient les habitants du voisinage. Ils cherchaient un indice capable de révéler ce qui s'était produit ce jour-là. Puis arriva le 31 décembre 1984. Alors que la plupart des familles canadiennes se préparaient à célébrer le Nouvel An, une découverte allait mettre fin à des mois d'incertitude tout en ouvrant la porte à une douleur infiniment plus profonde. Dans une zone boisée située à plusieurs dizaines de kilomètres du domicile de Christine, un corps fut découvert. Les policiers arrivèrent rapidement sur les lieux. Le paysage était silencieux. L'air était glacial. La neige et la terre gelée recouvraient le sol. Les arbres semblaient figés sous le froid hivernal. Les enquêteurs avancèrent avec précaution. Très vite, leurs pires craintes furent confirmées. Le corps appartenait à Christine Jessop. La nouvelle se répandit à travers l'Ontario comme une onde de choc. Les habitants qui avaient suivi les recherches pendant des semaines furent bouleversés. Les parents serrèrent leurs enfants un peu plus fort ce soir-là. Les enquêteurs présents sur la scène comprirent immédiatement qu'ils n'étaient pas face à un simple accident. L'examen préliminaire révéla des signes de violence. La fillette n'était pas simplement décédée. Elle avait été victime d'un crime. Un crime d'une brutalité qui choqua même des policiers expérimentés. Les détails exacts furent gardés confidentiels pendant longtemps, mais une conclusion apparut rapidement. Quelqu'un avait enlevé Christine. Quelqu'un lui avait fait du mal. Quelqu'un l'avait tuée. La découverte du corps transforma immédiatement l'enquête. Désormais, il ne s'agissait plus de retrouver une enfant disparue. Il s'agissait d'identifier un meurtrier. La pression sur les enquêteurs devint immense. L'affaire occupa les manchettes nationales. Les médias consacrèrent de longues heures à couvrir chaque développement. Les journalistes rapportaient les moindres détails disponibles. Les citoyens voulaient des réponses. Ils voulaient savoir qui avait commis un acte aussi terrible. Ils voulaient croire que la personne responsable serait rapidement arrêtée. Mais les enquêteurs se retrouvaient devant un problème colossal. Le crime avait eu lieu plusieurs semaines auparavant. Le temps avait détruit de nombreuses traces. Les éléments matériels étaient limités. Les témoins directs semblaient inexistants. Le tueur paraissait s'être volatilisé. Pourtant, les policiers devaient poursuivre. Chaque piste fut examinée. Chaque voisin fut interrogé. Chaque personne ayant eu un contact avec Christine fut étudiée. Les enquêteurs passaient des journées entières à analyser des rapports, comparer des déclarations et tenter de construire une chronologie précise. Dans cette immense masse d'informations, un nom allait progressivement attirer l'attention. Un homme qui vivait près de la famille Jessop. Un homme qui connaissait le voisinage. Un homme discret. Reserve. Différent aux yeux de certains habitants. Son nom était Guy-Paul Morin. À ce moment-là, il n'était pas encore accusé. Il n'était pas encore considéré comme coupable. Mais l'histoire qui allait suivre allait transformer sa vie de manière irréversible. Pendant que les enquêteurs exploraient les différentes possibilités, plusieurs personnes commencèrent à évoquer son comportement inhabituel. Morin était un passionné de musique. Il passait beaucoup de temps seul. Il jouait de la clarinette. Il n'était pas particulièrement sociable. Dans une communauté où tout le monde semblait se connaître, cette différence attirait parfois l'attention. Ce qui, dans d'autres circonstances, aurait simplement fait de lui un voisin excentrique allait bientôt devenir un facteur déterminant. Parce que lorsque la peur s'installe dans une communauté, les perceptions changent. Les habitudes deviennent suspectes. Le silence devient étrange. La solitude devient inquiétante. Et les gens commencent à chercher des réponses même lorsqu'ils n'en ont pas. Au début de l'enquête, personne ne pouvait encore imaginer que cette affaire ne deviendrait pas seulement l'histoire tragique d'une petite fille assassinée. Elle deviendrait également l'histoire d'un système judiciaire confronté à ses propres erreurs. L'histoire d'une enquête qui allait s'étendre sur des décennies. L'histoire d'une vérité cachée sous des couches de certitude, de suppositions et de convictions. Mais tout cela appartenait encore à l'avenir. Pour l'instant, au cœur de l'hiver canadien, une famille enterrait sa fille. Une communauté pleurait une enfant. Et quelque part, la personne réellement responsable de sa mort continuait sa vie en liberté. Invisible, inconnue, observant peut-être les manchettes qui parlaient de son crime sans que personne ne sache encore son nom. L'enquête venait seulement d'entrer dans sa phase la plus importante. Et sans que quiconque puisse le prévoir, Elle s'apprêtait à emprunter une direction qui allait bouleverser plusieurs vies pour les décennies à venir. Le choc provoqué par la découverte du corps de Christine Jessop ne tarda pas à laisser place à une autre réalité, plus froide, plus méthodique, mais tout aussi bouleversante. Désormais, l'enquête entrait dans une phase où chaque détail comptait. Chaque fibre, chaque empreinte, chaque témoignage pouvait devenir la pièce manquante d'un puzzle terrifiant. Les policiers qui avaient travaillé sans relâche durant les semaines de recherche de l'enfant disparu se retrouvaient maintenant confrontés à une scène qui allait marquer leur carrière pour toujours. Le secteur boisé où Christine avait été retrouvée était isolé, silencieux et difficile d'accès. Les arbres dénudés de l'hiver formaient des silhouettes sombres contre le ciel gris. La neige partiellement fondue révélait une terre froide et humide. Les enquêteurs progressaient lentement, prenant soin de préserver le moindre indice. Personne ne voulait commettre une erreur. Pourtant, sans le savoir, certaines erreurs avaient déjà commencé à s'installer dans l'enquête. Les techniciens en identification photographiaient chaque centimètre du secteur. Les spécialistes recueillaient des échantillons de sol, des végétaux, des fibres et tout ce qui pouvait avoir été laissé par le meurtrier. Le corps de Christine était examiné avec une extrême prudence. Même les enquêteurs les plus expérimentés ressentaient une lourdeur particulière devant cette scène. Ce n'était pas seulement un homicide. C'était le meurtre d'une enfant. Dans ce genre de dossier, la pression est immense. La communauté exige des réponses. Les médias réclament des résultats. Les familles attendent une arrestation. Et les policiers ressentent eux-mêmes un besoin profond de rendre justice. C'est parfois dans ce contexte émotionnel intense que naissent les plus grandes erreurs d'enquête. Les premiers rapports médico-légaux confirmèrent rapidement que Christine avait été victime d'une agression sexuelle avant sa mort. Cette conclusion bouleversa davantage encore l'opinion publique. L'image d'une petite fille innocente victime d'un prédateur inconnu provoqua une vague de peur dans toute la région. Les parents surveillaient davantage leurs enfants. Les écoles renforçaient les mesures de sécurité. Les habitants verrouillaient leurs portes plus tôt le soir. Chaque inconnu devenait potentiellement suspect. Chaque visage semblait pouvoir cacher un danger. Pendant ce temps, les enquêteurs tentaient de reconstruire les derniers instants de la vie de Christine. Ils analysaient son trajet du 12 octobre. Ils examinaient les témoignages recueillis durant les recherches. Ils comparaient les horaires. Ils tentaient de comprendre à quel moment précis l'enfant avait disparu. Plus ils avançaient, plus ils se concentraient sur le voisinage immédiat. Les statistiques criminelles de l'époque suggéraient qu'un crime contre un enfant était souvent commis par quelqu'un vivant relativement près de la victime ou connaissant son environnement. Cette hypothèse paraissait logique. Pourtant, elle allait progressivement devenir une obsession. Dans les semaines qui suivirent, les enquêteurs établirent une liste de personnes vivant à proximité de la famille Jessop. Parmi ces noms figurait Guy-Paul Morin. À première vue, rien ne semblait le distinguer d'autres résidents. Il travaillait, vivait discrètement et n'avait aucun passé criminel violent. Mais plusieurs éléments attirèrent l'attention des policiers. Morin était solitaire. Il passait beaucoup de temps seul. Il avait des habitudes jugées inhabituelles par certains voisins. Il consacrait une grande partie de son temps libre à la musique. Il jouait de la clarinette pendant des heures. Dans une enquête parfaitement objective, ces éléments n'auraient probablement représenté qu'une simple description de personnalité. Mais dans un contexte de peur collective, ils commencèrent à prendre une signification différente. Peu à peu, les enquêteurs développèrent une théorie. Et une fois qu'une théorie s'installe dans l'esprit humain, il devient parfois difficile d'en sortir. Les spécialistes appellent cela la vision tunnel. On commence avec une hypothèse, puis chaque information est interprétée à travers cette hypothèse. Les éléments qui confirment la théorie paraissent importants. Ceux qui la contredisent paraissent secondaires. À ce stade de l'enquête, personne ne réalisait encore à quel point ce phénomène allait influencer les années à venir. Les policiers commencèrent à examiner chaque aspect de la vie de Morin. Ils analysèrent ses déplacements. Ils interrogèrent ses voisins. Ils examinèrent ses habitudes quotidiennes. Chaque détail semblait désormais suspect. Son caractère réservé devenait un signe potentiel de secret. Sa passion pour la musique devenait une preuve supposée de son isolement social. Son comportement calme était parfois interprété comme de la froideur émotionnelle. Pourtant, aucune preuve directe ne l'associait encore au crime. Les enquêteurs poursuivirent néanmoins leurs recherches. Ils recueillirent des échantillons de cheveux. Ils comparèrent des fibres textiles. Ils étudièrent des empreintes de pas découvertes dans certains secteurs. Les méthodes scientifiques de l'époque n'étaient pas aussi avancées qu'aujourd'hui. De nombreuses analyses reposaient davantage sur l'interprétation que sur des certitudes absolues. Certains experts affirmaient que des cheveux retrouvés pouvaient être compatibles avec ceux de Morin. Le mot compatible allait jouer un rôle immense dans cette affaire. Compatible ne signifiait pas identique. Compatible ne signifiait pas preuve. Compatible signifiait simplement qu'une exclusion absolue n'était pas possible. Pourtant, dans l'esprit du public comme parfois dans celui des enquêteurs, cette nuance devenait floue. Les médias suivaient l'enquête avec attention. Chaque développement était rapporté. Chaque rumeur circulait rapidement. À mesure que le nom de Morin apparaissait dans certaines discussions, les regards commencèrent à changer autour de lui. Dans les petites communautés, les soupçons se propagent souvent plus vite que les faits. Les habitants observaient désormais cet homme discret avec méfiance. Certains se demandaient s'il pouvait vraiment être impliqué. D'autres étaient déjà convaincus qu'il cachait quelque chose. Pendant ce temps, les enquêteurs poursuivaient leurs interrogatoires. Plusieurs témoins furent interrogés à de nombreuses reprises. Certains ne se souvenaient pas clairement des événements. D'autres exprimaient des incertitudes. Mais au fil des entretiens répétés, certains souvenirs semblaient devenir plus précis. Des personnes qui n'étaient pas certaines de ce qu'elles avaient vu devenaient progressivement plus affirmatives. Ce phénomène psychologique est aujourd'hui bien documenté. Les souvenirs humains ne fonctionnent pas comme des enregistrements vidéo. Ils peuvent être influencés par les discussions, les attentes et les suggestions. Mais dans les années 1980, cette réalité était encore moins comprise. Les enquêteurs continuaient donc à accumuler des éléments qu'ils considéraient comme des confirmations de leur théorie. Le dossier grandissait. Les rapports s'empilaient. Pourtant, malgré tous leurs efforts, aucune preuve irréfutable n'apparaissait. Aucune empreinte digitale décisive. Aucun témoin direct du crime. Aucun aveu. Rien qui permette d'affirmer avec certitude que Guy-Paul Morin avait enlevé ou tué Christine Jessop. Mais au lieu de remettre en question leur hypothèse principale, certains enquêteurs renforcèrent encore davantage leurs convictions. Plus le temps passait, plus ils étaient persuadés qu'ils avaient identifié le bon suspect. La pression publique contribuait également à cette dynamique. Les citoyens voulaient une arrestation. Les médias voulaient des réponses. Les responsables politiques voulaient montrer que l'enquête progressait. Dans ce climat, l'idée qu'un suspect principal ait été identifié semblait rassurante. Les mois continuèrent de s'écouler. Pour la famille Jessop, chaque journée sans réponse représentait une nouvelle souffrance. Les anniversaires passaient. Les fêtes arrivaient puis disparaissaient. La chambre de Christine demeurait vide. Les photographies de la petite fille continuaient d'orner les murs de la maison familiale. Son absence était devenue une présence constante. Pendant ce temps, Guy-Paul Morin ignorait encore que sa vie s'approchait d'un tournant catastrophique. Il continuait à vivre sous le regard croissant des enquêteurs. Chaque déplacement était observé. Chaque déclaration était analysée. Chaque réaction était interprétée. Peu à peu, le dossier semblait se construire non pas autour de preuves solides, mais autour d'une conviction collective. Une conviction qui gagnait en force à mesure qu'elle était répétée. Les spécialistes médico-légaux poursuivaient leurs examens. Les enquêteurs continuaient leurs réunions stratégiques. Les procureurs étudiaient les informations disponibles. Tous cherchaient à bâtir un dossier capable de convaincre un jury. Pourtant, sous cette accumulation de documents et d'analyses, une question fondamentale demeurait sans réponse. Où était la preuve incontestable? Où était l'élément permettant de relier directement Morin au meurtre de Christine? Cette question allait accompagner toute l'affaire pendant des années. Mais à ce moment précis, l'élan de l'enquête avançait dans une seule direction. Une direction qui semblait logique aux yeux de nombreux acteurs du dossier. Une direction qui allait bientôt conduire à une arrestation spectaculaire, à des procès très médiatisés et à l'une des plus grandes erreurs judiciaires de l'histoire canadienne. Les enquêteurs croyaient s'approcher de la vérité. En réalité, ils s'en éloignaient peut-être davantage à chaque nouveau pas. Les années qui suivirent la découverte du corps de Christine Jessop furent marquées par une succession de décisions qui allaient progressivement transformer une enquête complexe en ce que plusieurs experts décriront plus tard comme un exemple classique de vision tunnel. À mesure que les policiers approfondissaient leurs recherches, l'idée que Guy-Paul Morin était responsable du meurtre semblait prendre de plus en plus de place dans leur esprit. Ce n'était plus simplement une hypothèse parmi d'autres. C'était devenu la théorie dominante autour de laquelle s'organisait pratiquement toute l'enquête. Dans les bureaux des enquêteurs, des cartes étaient accrochées au mur. Des photographies de la victime, des schémas de déplacement, des rapports d'expertise et des dizaines de comptes rendus d'entretien remplissaient les dossiers. Chaque nouvelle information était examinée à travers une question centrale. Comment cette donnée pouvait-elle confirmer l'implication de Morin? Cette manière de penser allait peu à peu éloigner les enquêteurs d'autres pistes possibles. Pourtant, à l'extérieur, le temps continuait de passer. Les saisons changeaient. Les hivers cédaient leur place au printemps. Les habitants de Kingsville tentaient de reprendre une vie normale. Mais le souvenir de Christine demeurait omniprésent. Les parents continuaient à surveiller leurs enfants avec davantage de prudence. Les conversations revenaient régulièrement sur le même sujet. Beaucoup se demandaient si le meurtrier se trouvait encore parmi eux. D'autres étaient déjà convaincus que la police avait identifié le coupable. Pendant ce temps, Guy-Paul Morin vivait sous une pression croissante. Les regards des voisins avaient changé. Certaines personnes évitaient sa présence. D'autres l'observaient discrètement lorsqu'il traversait la rue ou faisait ses courses. La suspicion s'était installée bien avant qu'un tribunal ne rende la moindre décision. Ce phénomène est fréquent dans les affaires criminelles très médiatisées. Une fois qu'un nom apparaît publiquement comme celui d'un suspect potentiel, l'opinion collective commence souvent à construire sa propre version de l'histoire. Les nuances disparaissent. Les doutes s'effacent. La présomption d'innocence devient fragile. Les enquêteurs poursuivaient leurs efforts pour renforcer leur dossier. Ils revenaient sans cesse sur les témoignages recueillis dans les premiers mois de l'affaire. Certains témoins furent réinterrogés plusieurs fois. À chaque entretien, les souvenirs semblaient parfois évoluer légèrement. Une personne qui n'était pas certaine d'avoir aperçu Morin à un endroit précis devenait progressivement plus affirmatrice. Une autre croyait reconnaître un véhicule similaire au sien. Une troisième pensait avoir remarqué un comportement étrange. Individuellement, ces éléments paraissaient faibles. Ensemble, ils donnaient l'impression d'un ensemble cohérent. Pourtant, cette cohérence reposait davantage sur l'interprétation que sur des certitudes objectives. Les spécialistes de la mémoire humaine expliqueraient plus tard combien les souvenirs peuvent être influencés par le contexte des interrogatoires. Lorsqu'une personne est interrogée à plusieurs reprises sur un même événement, elle peut inconsciemment modifier sa perception des faits. Mais à cette époque, ces mécanismes étaient rarement pris en compte dans les enquêtes criminelles. Les analyses médico-légales occupaient également une place importante dans le dossier. Des cheveux, des fibres textiles et divers échantillons avaient été collectés. Les experts comparaient minutieusement ces éléments avec ceux provenant de Morin. Cependant, les techniques disponibles au milieu des années 1980 étaient loin de posséder la précision des méthodes modernes. De nombreux examens reposaient sur des ressemblances visuelles ou des probabilités générales plutôt que sur des identifications scientifiques définitives. Malgré cela, certains résultats furent présentés comme particulièrement significatifs. Les enquêteurs y voyaient des confirmations supplémentaires de leur théorie. Les avocats de la défense, eux, soulignaient déjà les limites de ces analyses. Mais leur voix était largement couverte par le poids émotionnel de l'affaire. En 1985 puis en 1986, la pression pour résoudre définitivement le meurtre de Christine Jessop atteignit un niveau considérable. Les médias nationaux suivaient l'enquête avec attention. Les journalistes publiaient régulièrement de nouveaux articles. Les familles canadiennes connaissaient désormais le visage de la petite victime. L'affaire dépassait largement les frontières de Kingsville. Elle était devenue une affaire nationale. Dans ce contexte, les autorités décidèrent finalement d'agir. Guy-Paul Morin fut arrêté et accusé du meurtre de Christine Jessop. L'annonce fit immédiatement la une des journaux. Pour beaucoup de citoyens, cette arrestation représentait la fin d'un long cauchemar. Ils pensaient que le meurtrier avait enfin été identifié. Les proches de la victime espéraient obtenir des réponses. Les enquêteurs étaient convaincus que leur travail avait porté ses fruits. Mais au sein du système judiciaire, l'histoire ne faisait que commencer. Le premier procès attira une attention considérable. Les salles d'audience étaient remplies de journalistes. Les familles observaient chaque témoignage avec émotion. Les procureurs présentèrent leurs théories avec assurance. Selon eux, Morin était le responsable du crime. Ils mirent en avant les éléments recueillis pendant l'enquête, les analyses médico-légales disponibles et plusieurs témoignages qu'ils considéraient comme importants. Les avocats de la défense contestèrent vigoureusement cette version. Ils soulignèrent l'absence de preuves directes. Ils rappelèrent que de nombreux éléments reposaient sur des interprétations. Ils insistèrent sur les incertitudes entourant les analyses scientifiques utilisées à l'époque. Les débats furent longs et complexes. Chaque détail était disséqué. Chaque mot prononcé prenait une importance considérable. Pourtant, malgré toute cette attention, le jury ne parvint pas à un consensus. Les jurés restèrent divisés. Certains estimaient que les preuves étaient suffisantes. D'autres considéraient qu'un doute raisonnable subsistait. Le procès se termina sans verdict définitif. Cette absence de conclusion créa une situation étrange. Officiellement, l'affaire n'était pas terminée. Mais dans l'opinion publique, beaucoup continuaient à croire que Morin était coupable. Le simple fait qu'il ait été accusé semblait suffire à convaincre une partie de la population. Pour Morin, cette période fut particulièrement éprouvante. Même sans condamnation, sa réputation était gravement endommagée. Son nom était associé au meurtre d'une enfant. Les regards méfiants se multipliaient. Les relations sociales devenaient difficiles. La vie quotidienne se transformait en combat permanent contre les soupçons. Pourtant, il continuait à clamer son innocence. Année après année, il répétait qu'il n'avait rien à voir avec la mort de Christine Jessop. Peu de gens l'écoutaient réellement. Les enquêteurs, eux, ne renoncèrent pas. Ils demeuraient persuadés d'avoir identifié le bon suspect. Au lieu de réexaminer l'ensemble de l'enquête à partir de zéro, ils poursuivirent leurs efforts pour renforcer encore davantage leur dossier. D'autres analyses furent réalisées. D'autres experts furent consultés. De nouveaux témoignages furent examinés. Chaque étape semblait rapprocher les autorités d'un nouveau procès. Derrière cette détermination se cachait une conviction profonde. Beaucoup de responsables croyaient sincèrement que Morin était coupable. Ils ne cherchaient pas nécessairement à fabriquer des preuves. Ils pensaient poursuivre la vérité. Mais lorsqu'une conviction devient trop forte, elle peut influencer la manière dont chaque information est interprétée. Ce phénomène allait devenir l'un des thèmes centraux des analyses réalisées des années plus tard. Pendant ce temps, la véritable identité du meurtrier demeurait inconnue. Quelque part, la personne responsable de la mort de Christine continuait sa vie sans être inquiétée. Les années passaient. Les souvenirs du crime s'estompaient progressivement dans certaines parties du pays. Mais pour les familles concernées, rien ne changeait. La famille Jessop vivait toujours avec l'absence de Christine. Morin vivait toujours sous le poids d'une accusation qui refusait de disparaître. Les autorités préparaient discrètement une nouvelle confrontation judiciaire. Personne ne pouvait encore imaginer que les plus grands bouleversements de cette affaire ne viendraient pas d'un témoin inattendu, ni d'un aveu spectaculaire. Ils viendraient d'une révolution scientifique qui commençait lentement à transformer les enquêtes criminelles à travers le monde. Une technologie encore récente, encore imparfaite, mais capable de répondre à une question que des années d'enquête, des milliers de pages de rapports et des centaines d'heures d'audience n'avaient jamais réussi à résoudre avec certitude. Cette technologie portait un nom qui allait bientôt changer à jamais le destin de Guy-Paul Morin, l'ADN. For years, the case seemed frozen in place. In court records, in newspaper archives, and in the minds of countless Canadians, the murder of Christine Jessop had already been solved. A jury had spoken. A sentence had been handed down. A man sat behind bars carrying the label of child killer. To most people, that should have been the end of the story. But inside a prison cell, Guy Paul Morin continued repeating the same words he had spoken from the very beginning. He was innocent. The statement sounded almost meaningless after so many years. Every prison contained inmates who claimed they had been framed, misunderstood, or wrongly convicted. Guards heard those claims every day. Lawyers heard them every day. Judges heard them every day. Most of the time, those claims led nowhere. Yet Morin refused to change his story. Not after losing his freedom. Not after losing his reputation. Not after watching neighbors, friends, and strangers become convinced he was a monster. He continued to insist that he had never harmed Christine Jessop. Outside prison walls, a small group of supporters still believed him. Some family members. Some legal advocates. A few journalists who had begun digging deeper into the case. As the years passed, questions slowly emerged. Why had so much of the investigation focused on Morin from the very beginning? Why had alternative suspects received so little attention? Why had certain witness statements changed over time? Why did some forensic conclusions seem less certain when independent experts reviewed them? The questions accumulated like small cracks spreading through concrete. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they suggested something much larger. Something might be wrong. Meanwhile, science was changing. The early 1990s marked a revolution in criminal investigations. For decades, police had relied on fingerprints, witness testimony, blood typing, fibers, hairs, and circumstantial evidence. Now a new tool was beginning to emerge: DNA. At first, the technology seemed almost unbelievable. A tiny biological trace left behind by a person could identify them with extraordinary accuracy. To many investigators, it felt like science fiction becoming reality. To defense lawyers working on behalf of Morin, it felt like hope. If biological evidence from Christine Jessup's murder still existed, modern testing might finally answer a question that had haunted Canada for years. Was the right man in prison? The challenge was enormous. The crime had occurred years earlier. Evidence had been collected using procedures that were primitive compared to modern standards. Some samples had degraded. Others had been stored for long periods. There was no guarantee anything useful remained. Yet the possibility was too important to ignore. Requests were made. Legal motions were filed. Experts were consulted. Months stretched into years. Then came the moment that would eventually reshape Canadian criminal justice forever. Scientists began analyzing preserved biological material connected to the murder. The process was slow and meticulous. Laboratories worked carefully, knowing the significance of the case. There was no room for error. Every step was documented. Every result was reviewed. For the people waiting, the uncertainty felt unbearable. If the DNA matched Morin, the debate would end. If it excluded him, everything would change. The answer finally arrived, and it shocked nearly everyone. The DNA did not match Guy Paul Morin. Not partially, not approximately, not ambiguously. It simply was not him. The biological evidence pointed away from the man sitting in prison. At first, some officials struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Could there be a mistake? Could contamination explain the results? Additional testing was conducted. Independent reviews followed. Experts examined the findings again and again. The conclusion remained identical. The DNA belonged to someone else. The implications were staggering. An innocent man might have spent years under suspicion. An innocent man might have been convicted. An innocent man might have lost a decade of his life, while the actual killer remained free. The legal system began moving rapidly. Courtrooms that had once seemed certain now faced uncertainty. Lawyers returned to evidence that had been considered settled. Judges reviewed scientific findings that had never existed during earlier proceedings. Public confidence began to waver. Newspapers that once described Morin as a murderer now published headlines filled with questions. Television reporters revisited old footage. Journalists re-examined the investigation from the beginning. Across Ontario, conversations changed. People who had once been certain suddenly found themselves wondering whether certainty had been an illusion. Inside prison, Morin waited. Years of disappointment had taught him not to celebrate too early. He understood better than anyone how slowly systems could move. But for the first time, there was objective evidence supporting what he had said all along. The truth was finally beginning to surface. In 1995, the breakthrough became impossible to ignore. The conviction collapsed. The verdict that had defined his life was overturned. After years of being portrayed as one of Canada's most notorious child killers, Guy Paul Morin walked out of prison as a free man. Freedom, however, did not arrive with celebration. No parade waited outside. No miracle restored the lost years. No court order could erase memories. As cameras followed him, observers noticed something striking. He did not look victorious. He looked exhausted. The years had left their mark. His hair had changed. His face carried the weight of experiences few people could imagine. He had entered the criminal justice system as a suspect. He emerged as a symbol of failure within that same system. For many Canadians, the moment felt both uplifting and disturbing. An innocent man had regained his freedom. But that freedom exposed a horrifying reality. The real killer had never been caught. Christine Jessup was still dead. Her family still lacked answers. The person responsible had escaped justice for more than a decade. The breakthrough that freed Morin simultaneously reopened one of Canada's most painful unsolved murders. Investigators now faced a difficult challenge. They had to return to the beginning. Everything, every witness statement, every suspect, every lead, every overlooked detail. Nothing could be assumed anymore. The tunnel vision that had dominated the original investigation was now impossible to deny. Experts studying the case began identifying numerous warning signs. Investigators had become convinced Morin was guilty early in the process. Once that belief formed, evidence was often interpreted through that assumption. Information supporting guilt received attention. Information suggesting innocence received less attention. The pattern appeared repeatedly. The more officials examined the case, the more troubling it became. Some witnesses had provided uncertain observations that later appeared more confident. Some forensic testimony had exceeded what science could actually support. Some potentially important information had not been fully disclosed. The errors did not necessarily result from malicious intent. Many involved genuinely believed they were pursuing justice. But good intentions could not erase consequences. A child was dead. An innocent man had gone to prison. A murderer remained unidentified. The case transformed from a murder investigation into something larger. It became a lesson. Police academies discussed it. Law schools analyzed it. Judges referenced it. Legal experts across Canada studied the mistakes in extraordinary detail. How could an entire system become convinced of something that was not true? The answer was uncomfortable, because human beings are vulnerable to certainty. Once a theory feels convincing, contradictory evidence often becomes harder to see. The phenomenon became known as tunnel vision, and nowhere was its danger more visible than in the Morin case. As public scrutiny intensified, pressure mounted for deeper examination. Government officials recognized that simply releasing Morin was not enough. Canadians deserved answers. An extensive public inquiry was launched. The investigation stretched across years. Witnesses testified. Documents were reviewed. Decisions were dissected. The resulting findings painted a deeply troubling picture. Mistakes had occurred at multiple levels. Investigative errors, forensic errors, disclosure problems, assumptions presented as facts. The report would eventually recommend sweeping reforms designed to prevent similar tragedies. But while experts debated policy and procedure, another family remained trapped in grief. The Jessup family. For them, the DNA breakthrough created mixed emotions. The possibility of correcting a wrongful conviction was important. It also meant returning to uncertainty, returning to unanswered questions, returning to the nightmare that had begun in October 1984. The person who murdered Christine had disappeared back into the shadows. The search would have to begin again. Years passed. Technology continued advancing. DNA science became more sophisticated. Databases expanded. Methods improved. Investigators preserved evidence, hoping that future breakthroughs might accomplish what previous generations could not. The wait felt endless. But the breakthrough that freed Morin had already achieved something historic. It proved that truth can survive even when buried beneath years of assumptions. It demonstrated that science could challenge certainty. It revealed that convictions are not the same thing as justice. And it reminded an entire country that wrongful convictions are not theoretical possibilities. They happen to real people. People with names, families, dreams, lives. For Guy Paul Morin, the breakthrough represented vindication. For the justice system, it represented accountability. For Christine Jessup's family, it represented unfinished business. And for Canada, it became one of the most important turning points in the history of criminal investigations. The story was no longer simply about a murdered child. It was no longer simply about a man who had been accused. It had become a story about truth itself. how difficult it can be to find, how easy it can be to lose, and how powerful it can be when it finally emerges from the darkness after years of silence. The next chapter would bring a renewed search for the actual killer, a search that would continue long after Morin walked free, carrying investigators into the future and toward revelations that nobody in 1984 could have imagined. The years that followed Guy Paul Morin's exoneration transformed what had once been considered a closed murder case into one of the most scrutinized justice failures in Canadian history. Courtrooms had delivered their verdicts. Judges had issued rulings. Jurors had listened to weeks of testimony and concluded that Morin was guilty. Yet, DNA evidence had shattered those conclusions with brutal simplicity. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If an innocent man had been convicted of murdering Christine Jessup, then the justice system itself had become part of the story. And now the system would be forced to answer for its mistakes. Public pressure intensified across Ontario. Newspapers published lengthy investigations. Television programs revisited the case. Legal scholars debated how such a failure could have occurred despite years of procedures designed to prevent wrongful convictions. The question echoed through court buildings, police stations, law schools, and government offices. How had this happened? The provincial government eventually launched a comprehensive public inquiry. The objective was not merely to examine Guy Paul Morin's conviction. The objective was to understand every decision that had led to it. The inquiry became one of the most detailed examinations of a wrongful conviction ever conducted in Canada. Boxes of documents were reviewed. Thousands of pages of reports were analyzed. Witnesses returned to testify about events that had occurred years earlier. Police officers explained investigative decisions. Forensic experts defended scientific conclusions. Lawyers discussed evidence that had been presented to juries. As the hearings unfolded, a troubling pattern emerged. The mistakes had not come from a single catastrophic error. Instead, they had accumulated slowly. One assumption led to another. One overlooked detail led to another. One mistaken interpretation reinforced the next. Like individual threads woven together, they eventually created a narrative powerful enough to convince investigators, prosecutors, jurors, and much of the public that Guy Paul Morin was guilty. The inquiry examined the phenomenon known as tunnel vision. Investigators had focused intensely on Morin very early in the investigation. Once that focus developed, evidence often became filtered through the belief that they already had their suspect. Information appearing to support guilt received attention. Information suggesting innocence sometimes received less. The effect was subtle. It was rarely intentional. Yet its consequences proved devastating. Experts explained how tunnel vision can influence every stage of a criminal investigation. Witness statements may be interpreted differently. Alternative suspects may receive less scrutiny. Forensic findings may be viewed through a particular lens. Questions become designed to confirm theories rather than challenge them. The inquiry revealed examples of exactly those problems. Some witness accounts evolved over time. Some scientific conclusions had been presented with greater certainty than the evidence justified. Some information favorable to Morin had not been fully disclosed to his defense team. Each issue alone might not have caused a wrongful conviction. Together, they created a perfect storm. As testimony continued, many Canadians watched with disbelief. The justice system was supposed to protect innocent people. Yet the inquiry demonstrated how easily assumptions could become accepted facts. For Guy Paul Morin, the proceedings were deeply personal. Every hearing forced him to relive years of suffering. Every document reminded him of lost opportunities. Every witness recalled moments when his life had been gradually dismantled. He had spent years being described as a child killer. Years watching strangers look at him with fear or disgust. Years carrying accusations that never should have belonged to him. The inquiry could expose mistakes. It could recommend reforms. But it could never return those years. Observers often noticed Morin's calm demeanor during public appearances. He rarely displayed anger publicly. Yet beneath that composure existed the reality of everything he had endured. Relationships damaged, dreams interrupted, a reputation destroyed, an entire chapter of life consumed by a crime he did not commit. Meanwhile, Christine Jessup's family continued living with their own tragedy. For them, the inquiry brought complex emotions. The exoneration of an innocent man mattered. Justice required truth. But every discussion about investigative failures also reopened memories of Christine. The smiling 9-year-old girl at the center of the case remained gone. No inquiry could change that. No report could bring her back. The focus on Morin's innocence sometimes created a difficult balance. The public increasingly viewed the case as a story about wrongful conviction. It remained, first and foremost, a story about a murdered child. Christine's family still lacked the answer they had sought since October 1984. Who killed her? The inquiry eventually produced a massive report. Its conclusions were blunt. Investigators had made serious mistakes. Forensic procedures required improvement. Disclosure obligations needed strengthening. Training standards had to evolve. Most importantly, safeguards were necessary to prevent tunnel vision from influencing future investigations. The report contained more than 100 recommendations. Those recommendations would reshape Canadian criminal justice for years to come. Police agencies modified investigative practices. Prosecutors reviewed disclosure procedures. Forensic laboratories adopted stricter standards. Judges, lawyers, and investigators began receiving additional education about wrongful convictions. The impact extended far beyond Ontario. Across Canada, the Morin case became required study material. Future investigators learned how certainty can become dangerous. Future prosecutors learned the importance of full disclosure. Future forensic experts learned the consequences of overstating conclusions. The lessons were written in the experiences of a man who should never have been convicted. Yet despite these reforms, one uncomfortable truth remained. The actual killer was still unidentified. Years passed, then decades. Technology continued advancing. DNA science evolved dramatically from the techniques available in the early 1990s. Investigators preserved evidence from the Jessup case. Every advancement in forensic science created new possibilities. Perhaps one day, the biological evidence would reveal what earlier generations could not. Perhaps one day, Christine's family would finally receive an answer. That possibility remained alive. The case continued to exist in databases. Evidence remained available for future testing. Investigators never entirely closed the door. Then, years later, a breakthrough finally arrived. Advances in DNA technology allowed experts to extract information that had previously been impossible to obtain. Scientists compared genetic material against new sources. The results pointed investigators toward a man named Calvin Hoover. Unlike Guy Paul Morin, Hoover had not spent years at the center of public suspicion. He had been known to the Jessup family. He lived within their broader social circle. For decades, his name had remained largely absent from public discussions surrounding the murder. Now science was directing investigators toward him. Further analysis strengthened the conclusion. The DNA evidence identified Hoover as the source connected to Christine's murder. The discovery finally answered the question that had haunted the case for more than 3 decades. Who killed Christine Jessup? The answer was no longer uncertain. The evidence pointed to Calvin Hoover. But there was another cruel twist. Hoover had died in 2015. He could never be arrested. He could never stand trial. He could never face a jury. He could never be questioned about what happened to Christine. When police publicly announced their findings in 2020, reactions were mixed. There was relief. There was sadness. There was frustration. For Christine's family, the announcement finally provided truth. After decades of uncertainty, they knew who had taken their daughter. Yet there would never be a courtroom confrontation. No conviction. No sentencing hearing. No opportunity to watch justice unfold. The truth arrived long after traditional justice had become impossible. For Guy Paul Morin, the revelation carried a different significance. The DNA evidence did more than exonerate him. It completely removed any lingering doubt. He had not merely benefited from reasonable doubt. He had not escaped conviction through a technicality. He was innocent, entirely innocent. From the first day of the investigation to the final announcement decades later, he had told the truth. The true killer had been someone else all along. The case now stood as both a tragedy and a warning. A tragedy because a child lost her life. A warning because institutions built to pursue justice had mistakenly targeted an innocent man. Courtrooms often seek certainty. Jurors want answers. Communities demand closure. But the Morin case demonstrated the danger of reaching conclusions too quickly. Sometimes the most convincing story is not the correct one. Sometimes evidence must be questioned repeatedly. Sometimes assumptions must be challenged. And sometimes justice requires admitting mistakes. By the time the final pieces fell into place, decades had passed since Christine disappeared while walking through her quiet neighborhood. Entire generations had grown up. Technology had transformed. Investigators had retired. Yet the case continued teaching lessons. In law schools, in police academies, in forensic laboratories, and in courtrooms across Canada. The justice chapter of this story is not defined by a guilty verdict. It is defined by the pursuit of truth after that verdict proved wrong. It is defined by a system willing, however slowly, to examine its own failures. And it is defined by the enduring importance of evidence over assumption. Because in the end, truth survived. It survived public opinion. It survived years of accusations. It survived flawed investigations. It survived wrongful conviction. And when it finally emerged completely, it changed Canadian criminal justice forever. On the surface, the story ended in 2020. The DNA had finally identified Christine Jessup's killer. The innocent man who had spent years under suspicion had been fully exonerated. The real offender had been named. The mystery that had haunted Canada for more than 3 decades appeared to have reached its conclusion. But some stories never truly end. They continue living inside the people left behind. They continue echoing through institutions that failed. They continue resurfacing whenever someone asks how justice can go wrong. And few cases demonstrate that reality more clearly than the story of Christine Jessup and Guy Paul Morin. To understand the aftermath, it is necessary to return to a simple image. A little girl walking toward a neighborhood store on an autumn afternoon. 9 years old. A child whose future should have been filled with school concerts, birthday parties, friendships, graduation photographs, first jobs, and countless ordinary moments that eventually become a life. Instead, her future ended on a rural road in Ontario in 1984. Everything that followed grew from that single tragedy. For Christine's family, the passage of time never erased the loss. Years turned into decades. Seasons changed. Neighborhoods evolved. Technology transformed daily life. Yet the absence remained. A chair at family gatherings. A name spoken in conversation. A photograph preserved in an album. The kind of absence that never completely disappears. The identification of Calvin Hoover in 2020 finally provided answers. But answers are not the same as healing. Knowing who committed the crime could never restore what had been taken. There would be no trial, no verdict, no opportunity to confront the killer in court, no chance to hear an explanation, no possibility of punishment. The truth arrived after the person responsible had already died. For many families, justice and truth travel together. In this case, they arrived separately. Truth finally appeared. Justice, in its traditional form, remained out of reach. At the same time, another life had also been permanently altered. Guy Paul Morin entered the investigation as a private citizen. He was not famous. He was not powerful. He was simply a quiet man living in a small community. His interests were ordinary. His routines were ordinary. His future appeared ordinary. Then suspicion changed everything. The years that followed transformed him into one of the most recognizable names in Canadian legal history. Not because of something he did, because of something he did not do. There's a unique kind of suffering attached to wrongful conviction. Physical freedom is taken away, but something else disappears as well. Identity, reputation, trust, the simple ability to walk into a room without people assuming the worst about you. For years, Morin lived under one of the most devastating accusations imaginable. Society believed he had murdered a child. Even after his release, complete freedom did not arrive overnight. Public memory does not change as quickly as legal records. Some people still remembered headlines. Some still remembered courtroom reports. Some still struggled to separate accusation from truth. The legal system could declare him innocent. The DNA could prove it scientifically. Yet rebuilding a life remained a far more complicated process. Ontario eventually provided financial compensation. The amount reached millions of dollars. To many observers, that seemed substantial. But placing a dollar value on lost years is impossible. How much is a decade worth? How much is a damaged reputation worth? How much is the experience of being feared, hated, and isolated worth? No government can truly answer those questions. Money can provide stability. It cannot return time. It cannot restore youth. It cannot erase memories. Morin himself often suggested that the most painful aspect of his ordeal was not prison. It was the belief, the knowledge that countless people genuinely thought he had committed an unspeakable crime. That burden followed him long after prison doors opened. Yet his story gradually became something larger than personal tragedy. It became a catalyst for change. Across Canada, legal professionals began studying the case in extraordinary detail. Police officers, judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors, forensic scientists, students entering criminal justice programs. The Morin case became required reading because it exposed vulnerabilities that existed throughout the system. The lessons were uncomfortable. Investigators learned that confidence can become dangerous. A suspect who appears unusual is not necessarily guilty. Behavior that seems strange may simply be personality. Assumptions are not evidence. Prosecutors learned the importance of complete disclosure. Defense attorneys learned how critical it is to challenge forensic conclusions. Scientists learned to communicate uncertainty honestly. Every institution involved found reasons for reflection. The phrase tunnel vision became part of the national conversation. The concept sounds simple. Once investigators believe they have identified a suspect, they may begin interpreting everything through that belief. Evidence supporting the theory receives attention. Contradictory evidence receives less. The danger is rarely intentional. It often develops gradually. That is precisely what makes it so powerful. The Morin case transformed tunnel vision from an abstract concept into a documented reality. Future investigators would be trained to recognize it. Future supervisors would be encouraged to challenge assumptions. Future cases would be reviewed with greater awareness of its risks. The impact extended beyond Canada. Legal scholars around the world examined the case. Wrongful conviction projects cited it as a landmark example. International conferences discussed its lessons. In many ways, the suffering experienced by both Christine Jessup's family and Guy Paul Morin helped improve criminal justice systems far beyond Ontario. Yet there is another lesson hidden within the story. A lesson about science. When Christine disappeared in 1984, DNA testing was not yet capable of solving the case. Investigators relied on the tools available at the time. Hair comparisons, fiber analysis, witness recollections, behavioral assumptions. Many of those techniques carried limitations that were not fully understood. As technology advanced, certainty shifted. What once seemed convincing became questionable. What once seemed impossible became routine. DNA ultimately succeeded where traditional methods had failed. The case became one of the strongest demonstrations of forensic genetics ever seen in Canada. Today, investigators routinely use DNA databases, advanced sequencing techniques, and sophisticated analytical software. Many of those developments trace part of their public acceptance to cases like this one. The tragedy contributed to progress. A painful truth, but a truth nonetheless. There's also a broader human lesson. Communities often crave closure. When a terrible crime occurs, people want answers quickly. Fear creates pressure. Pressure creates urgency. Urgency sometimes creates mistakes. The murder of Christine Jessup terrified an entire community. Parents worried about their children. Neighbors looked suspiciously at one another. Reporters demanded updates. Investigators faced enormous expectations. In that environment, certainty became attractive. A suspect was identified. A narrative emerged. People wanted the story to end. But reality is rarely that simple. The desire for closure must never outweigh the search for truth. That lesson remains relevant decades later. Because wrongful convictions do not only harm the innocent person who is convicted, they also harm victims and families. Every moment spent pursuing the wrong suspect is a moment the actual offender remains free. In this case, the real killer escaped identification for decades. The consequences affected everyone involved. Perhaps that is why the story continues resonating today. It is not merely a murder case. It is not merely a wrongful conviction. It is a reminder of how fragile justice can be. Justice depends on evidence. Justice depends on humility. Justice depends on the willingness to admit mistakes. And perhaps most importantly, justice depends on the understanding that certainty must always be earned. As the years pass, newer cases capture public attention. New headlines appear. New investigations dominate news broadcasts. Yet the names Christine Jessup and Guy Paul Morin remain woven into Canadian legal history. One represents innocence lost through violence. The other represents innocence lost through accusation. Their stories became intertwined through circumstances neither chose. One family searched for answers. One man searched for vindication. Both journeys lasted far longer than they should have. Today, visitors driving through the quiet communities connected to the case might see ordinary streets, ordinary houses, and ordinary lives continuing around them. Children play in yards. Cars move along country roads. People go about daily routines. Nothing immediately reveals the history hidden beneath those landscapes. But history remains there. A reminder that truth sometimes takes years to emerge. A reminder that justice is a process, not a guarantee. And a reminder that every criminal investigation involves real human lives, each deserving fairness, accuracy, and compassion. In the end, the story of Christine Jessup and Guy Paul Morin leaves us with no perfect resolution. There is no happy ending, only truth. A child was murdered. An innocent man was wrongly convicted. A justice system confronted its own failures. And a nation learned lessons written in grief, perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of facts. Perhaps that is the final message of this case. Truth may be delayed. It may be buried beneath assumptions, mistakes, and years of uncertainty. But when people continue searching honestly, when evidence is allowed to speak louder than prejudice, and when institutions possess the courage to correct themselves, truth can still emerge from the darkness. And sometimes, even decades later, that truth has the power to change everything. The prison gates did not swing open with dramatic fanfare. There were no cheering crowds waiting outside, no triumphant music, no cinematic moment that could erase what had happened. On a cold January day in 1995, Guy Paul Morin stepped out of confinement, carrying something heavier than any suitcase. He carried 10 years of suspicion, 10 years of newspaper headlines, 10 years of whispered conversations in grocery stores and church parking lots, 10 years of living under one of the most hated labels imaginable. The courts had finally acknowledged what he had been saying from the beginning. The DNA evidence excluded him. The conviction was overturned. The man the public had believed was the murderer of 9-year-old Christine Jessup was innocent. Yet freedom did not arrive as a clean beginning. It arrived as a complicated, painful question. What happens after the world has spent a decade believing you are a monster? The cameras gathered outside. Reporters leaned forward with microphones. Some wanted reactions. Others wanted emotion. A few simply wanted a headline. Morin appeared exhausted rather than triumphant. The years had changed him. Prison had not merely taken away his liberty. It had interrupted the natural progression of a human life. While other people had built careers, started families, bought homes, celebrated birthdays, and planned futures, Morin had lived inside a system that repeatedly told him he was guilty of a crime he did not commit. The scars were invisible, but they were everywhere. For years, he had awakened each morning inside prison walls knowing that most of the country believed he had sexually assaulted and murdered a child. That accusation carried a unique weight. Even among inmates, crimes against children occupied a category of hatred all their own. Every interaction required caution. Every day demanded vigilance. Every letter from supporters became a lifeline. Every appeal represented another fragile hope. And still, through all of it, he had continued saying the same words. I am innocent. The remarkable thing was not that he eventually proved it. The remarkable thing was that he never stopped believing it could be proven. Outside prison, the reaction spread quickly across Canada. Many people felt relief. Others felt anger. Some experienced both simultaneously. Relief because an innocent man had finally been freed. Anger because the revelation exposed something deeply unsettling. If Guy Paul Morin had not killed Christine Jessup, then the real killer had been free all along. For more than a decade, that realization struck communities across the country with extraordinary force. People had trusted the investigation. They had trusted the experts. They had trusted the courts. Now those institutions faced uncomfortable questions. How had this happened? How could investigators become so convinced they had the right suspect that they overlooked evidence pointing elsewhere? How could forensic testimony presented with confidence later be revealed as deeply flawed? How could information favorable to the defense fail to receive proper attention? The answers would eventually fill thousands of pages. But at the center of every question stood two victims. One was Christine Jessup. The other was Guy Paul Morin. One had lost her life. The other had lost years that could never be returned. As public pressure mounted, Ontario established a public inquiry led by Justice Fred Kaufman. The goal was not simply to understand Morin's wrongful conviction. The goal was to understand every decision that had contributed to it. The inquiry became one of the most significant examinations of investigative failure in Canadian history. Witnesses testified for months. Police officers took the stand. Lawyers answered difficult questions. Experts reviewed forensic evidence. Documents were analyzed line by line. What emerged was a portrait not of a single catastrophic mistake, but of numerous smaller mistakes accumulating over time. A witness remembered something differently after repeated interviews. An investigator interpreted evidence through the lens of existing assumptions. Potentially important information received insufficient attention. Alternative suspects failed to receive adequate scrutiny. One error reinforced another. One assumption strengthened the next. Together, they formed a chain. By the time the chain reached the courtroom, it appeared strong. In reality, it had been built on fragile foundations. Again and again, the inquiry returned to a concept that would become famous throughout legal circles. Tunnel vision. The phrase sounds simple. Its consequences are not. Tunnel vision occurs when investigators become so convinced of a particular theory that they begin interpreting all evidence through that theory. Information supporting the theory appears significant. Information contradicting it appears less important. The danger is often invisible. The people experiencing it usually do not realize it is happening. Most investigators involved in the Jessup case genuinely believed they were pursuing justice. That was precisely what made the findings so disturbing. The problem was not widespread corruption. The problem was human certainty. Human beings naturally seek patterns. They naturally prefer explanations. They naturally become attached to conclusions. Once enough people accept a narrative, challenging it becomes increasingly difficult. The inquiry concluded that tunnel vision had influenced multiple stages of the investigation and prosecution. The findings sent shockwaves through Canada's legal system. Recommendations followed. Lots of them. More than 100 recommendations emerged from the inquiry. Changes were proposed regarding disclosure obligations. Investigators would need clearer standards concerning evidence sharing. Defense lawyers would gain greater access to information. Forensic science procedures would receive additional scrutiny. Training programs would emphasize the dangers of tunnel vision. Evidence preservation practices would improve. DNA technology would become increasingly central to criminal investigations. The reforms represented an attempt to ensure that another innocent person would not endure what Morin had experienced. Yet even the best reforms cannot erase history. For Guy Paul Morin, the challenge became learning how to exist outside prison after years spent fighting for his name. Imagine walking into a grocery store knowing strangers once believed you murdered a child. Imagine introducing yourself to someone who vaguely remembers seeing your face on television years earlier. Imagine trying to rebuild relationships after a decade defined by accusations. Exoneration restores legal innocence. It does not automatically restore trust. It does not erase memories. It does not eliminate suspicion. For some people, the DNA evidence settled everything immediately. For others, doubt lingered. That lingering doubt represented one of the cruelest consequences of wrongful convictions. Even after courts acknowledge innocence, public perception sometimes remains stubbornly resistant. Morin understood that reality better than anyone. Friends described the enormous emotional toll of the ordeal. The years had changed his relationship with the world. He had spent so much time defending himself that ordinary life sometimes felt unfamiliar. There were practical challenges too: employment, housing, social relationships, personal identity, all required reconstruction. The government eventually provided financial compensation. The amount reached several $1 million. Headlines focused on the number. Many readers viewed it as a victory. But compensation calculations reveal a difficult truth. No amount of money can purchase back lost time. No amount of money can recreate birthdays missed. No amount of money can restore youth. No amount of money can erase years spent behind bars. The compensation acknowledged harm. It could not undo it. Meanwhile, another painful reality remained unresolved. Christine Jessup's family still lacked complete answers. The wrongful conviction had consumed enormous investigative resources. Years passed. The real killer remained unidentified. Decades passed. The case continued haunting those connected to it. Christine remained forever 9 years old in photographs. A smiling child frozen in time. Family members aged. Parents grew older. Siblings built lives. Yet the absence remained. Birthdays arrived. Holidays came and went. The empty space persisted. For many Canadians, the story appeared complete after Morin's exoneration. But it was not. Not yet. The most important question still lacked an answer. Who killed Christine Jessup? Advances in forensic science eventually provided investigators with tools unimaginable during the 1980s. DNA technology improved dramatically. Samples once considered unusable became valuable. Evidence stored for decades could be re-examined using methods far more sophisticated than those available during the original investigation. The preserved evidence from Christine's case remained. Waiting, silent, patient. Science continued evolving around it. Finally, decades after the murder, investigators conducted new DNA analysis. The results pointed toward a different man entirely. His name was Calvin Hoover. Hoover had known the Jessup family. He lived within the broader social environment surrounding the victim. Most importantly, his DNA matched evidence connected to the crime. The conclusion was powerful. The biological evidence that excluded Guy Paul Morin implicated Calvin Hoover. Yet another tragedy accompanied the discovery. Hoover had died in 2015. He could not stand trial. He could not face a jury. He could not answer questions. The truth had emerged, but traditional justice could never fully follow. In 2020, authorities publicly announced their findings. The declaration finally removed any remaining uncertainty regarding Morin's innocence. Not probably innocent, not likely innocent, innocent, completely, unequivocally, from beginning to end. The announcement also delivered long-awaited answers to Christine's family. The answers arrived decades late, but they arrived. For many observers, the resolution highlighted the extraordinary power of DNA evidence. For others, it underscored the dangers of relying too heavily on subjective interpretations. Human memory can fail. Witnesses can be mistaken. Experts can be wrong. Assumptions can mislead. DNA does not solve every case. But in this case, it ultimately revealed what years of investigation had missed. As the story entered history books, legal textbooks, and criminal justice courses, it became more than a murder case. It became a lesson. Future investigators would study it. Future prosecutors would study it. Future defense attorneys would study it. Future judges would study it. The name Guy Paul Morin became synonymous with one of the most important wrongful conviction cases in Canadian history. Not because he committed a terrible crime, because he did not, and because the system failed to recognize that fact for far too long. Today, when people discuss the case, they often focus on procedures, evidence, and legal reforms. Those topics matter. But behind every recommendation and policy change are human lives. A little girl who never came home. A family that spent decades searching for answers. A man who lost years proving his innocence. Those realities should never be forgotten. The legacy of the case lives not only in legal reforms, but in a broader reminder about justice itself. Justice is not merely about convicting someone. It is about convicting the right person. The distinction may sound obvious, yet history repeatedly shows how difficult it can be in practice. When urgency replaces caution, when certainty replaces curiosity, and when assumptions replace evidence, innocent people can become trapped inside narratives they did not create. The story of Guy Paul Morin endures because it forces uncomfortable questions. It asks whether we are willing to challenge our own conclusions. It asks whether institutions can admit mistakes. It asks whether truth matters more than pride. Most importantly, it reminds us that every criminal investigation involves real human beings whose lives can be changed forever by a single decision. Christine Jessup deserved justice. Guy Paul Morin deserved fairness. For years, neither received what they deserved. The eventual arrival of truth could not erase the past, but it illuminated it. And sometimes, after decades of darkness, illumination itself becomes a form of justice. Years after the headlines faded and the television cameras disappeared, the ripple effects of the Christine Jessup case continued spreading through Canadian society in ways few people could have imagined during those frantic early days of the investigation. Courtrooms moved on to other cases. Police departments faced new crimes. Journalists chased new stories. Yet for those whose lives had been permanently altered by the tragedy, there was no moving on. There was only learning how to live with what remained. For Guy Paul Morin, innocence had finally been recognized by the legal system, but recognition and healing were not the same thing. Every morning carried reminders of years that could never be recovered. While friends and former neighbors had advanced through careers, marriages, and family milestones, Morin faced the difficult task of rebuilding a life interrupted by accusations that had once consumed the nation. He had entered the criminal justice system as a private citizen. He emerged as one of the most famous wrongful conviction victims in Canadian history. The attention followed him even after exoneration. People who met him often already knew his name. Some knew him as the man who had been wrongly convicted. Others remembered only fragments of old headlines. A few still harbored doubts, despite the overwhelming DNA evidence that had cleared him. That lingering suspicion represented one of the cruelest consequences of the ordeal. A prison sentence eventually ends. A damaged reputation can last forever. Morin rarely appeared eager to place himself in the spotlight. Those who observed him over the years often described a man who preferred quiet routines to public attention. He had always been reserved. Before the investigation, he was known as someone who enjoyed music, solitude, and predictable habits. The years of scrutiny had not changed that. If anything, they had deepened his desire for privacy. Yet privacy had become almost impossible. His name was now attached to legal textbooks, criminal justice seminars, documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, and discussions about wrongful convictions around the world. Students studied his case. Lawyers cited his case. Judges referenced lessons learned from his case. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man once portrayed as a killer had become one of the strongest examples of why justice systems must remain cautious before declaring anyone guilty. Meanwhile, the Jessup family faced a different journey. No court ruling could restore Christine. No scientific breakthrough could bring back the little girl who disappeared while walking through her community in October 1984. For decades, her family carried grief alongside uncertainty. The wrongful conviction of Morin had created an illusion of closure. Canadians believed the mystery had been solved. The family had been told a responsible person had been identified. Then years later, that certainty vanished. The conviction collapsed. The investigation effectively started over. Old wounds reopened. Questions returned. Pain that had never fully disappeared became visible again. When authorities eventually identified Calvin Hoover through advanced DNA testing decades later, the announcement produced complicated emotions. On one hand, the truth finally emerged. Investigators could state with confidence who had been responsible. On the other hand, the man identified as the killer was already dead. There would be no arrest, no trial, no cross-examination, no guilty verdict delivered before a courtroom filled with observers. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never occur. The best that science could provide was truth. Sometimes truth arrives too late to punish the guilty. But even delayed, truth carries value. For Christine's family, the identification of the actual killer answered questions that had lingered for more than 30 years. The uncertainty that had haunted every anniversary and every memorial could finally be replaced with knowledge. Pain remained, loss remained, but uncertainty no longer occupied the same space. Across Canada, legal experts continued examining the broader significance of the case. Many pointed to the investigation as a textbook example of how tunnel vision can infect an entire criminal proceeding. The concept became increasingly important in police training programs. Detectives were encouraged to remain open to alternative explanations. Supervisors were taught to challenge assumptions. Prosecutors became more aware of the dangers associated with relying too heavily on circumstantial interpretations when stronger scientific evidence was unavailable. The lessons extended beyond law enforcement. Forensic science itself underwent scrutiny. Experts who once testified with great confidence about hair comparisons, fiber analysis, and other forms of evidence found their methods being questioned more aggressively. Scientific disciplines that had once appeared definitive were reevaluated under modern standards. The result was not a rejection of forensic science. Rather, it was a demand for greater rigor, greater transparency, greater humility. The Morin case helped reinforce an important principle. Experts are human beings, and human beings can make mistakes. DNA technology transformed that conversation. In the decades following Morin's exoneration, DNA became one of the most powerful investigative tools in criminal justice. Countless cold cases were reopened. Innocent individuals were cleared. Previously unsolved crimes finally received answers. Investigators gained a tool capable of cutting through assumptions, biases, and flawed memories. The technology did not solve every problem, but it revealed how dangerous it could be to build an entire case around interpretations rather than objective evidence. As years passed, the story became larger than any single courtroom. It evolved into a cautionary tale, a warning, a reminder that justice systems are only as reliable as the people operating them. One mistaken witness identification may seem minor. One overlooked report may seem insignificant. One assumption may appear harmless. Yet when those pieces accumulate, they can reshape an entire investigation. In the Morin case, they nearly destroyed an innocent man's life forever. Perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in how ordinary everything initially appeared. There was no elaborate conspiracy, no secret organization manipulating events behind closed doors. Instead, there were investigators convinced they had found the right suspect, experts confident in their conclusions, witnesses trying to remember events from years earlier, prosecutors believing they were pursuing justice. The tragedy emerged not from a single act of corruption, but from a collection of human errors reinforcing one another. That reality makes the case more frightening, not less, because it demonstrates how easily mistakes can occur when certainty replaces skepticism. Today, visitors to legal conferences sometimes hear the name guy Paul Morin mentioned alongside discussions about reform, evidence disclosure, and wrongful convictions. Younger generations may know the case only through documentaries or academic studies. Yet behind every legal principle remains a human story. A little girl whose future was stolen. A family forced to endure decades of grief. A man who spent years insisting on his innocence while much of the country refused to believe him. And a justice system forced to confront its own imperfections. The story endures because it asks difficult questions without offering easy answers. How many safeguards are enough? How should investigators balance urgency with caution? What responsibility does society bear when an innocent person is wrongly accused? Can any amount of compensation truly repay lost years? These questions